In supermarkets across the United States, Australia, and Japan, eggs can be found in the refrigerated section alongside other cold items such as milk and cheese. However, in most other countries of the world, eggs can be found at room temperature alongside non-perishable food items. People eat both kinds of egg every day, usually without any ill effects. So why do some people refrigerate eggs and others don't? Well, the answer lies in the bacteria group known as Salmonella and how a particular country chooses to make sure their eggs don't get contaminated with it. Salmonella enters eggs through one of two ways: via contaminating the egg internally before the hen lays it, when a hen's ovaries have been infected, or via the porous eggshell, when an egg comes into contact with contaminated matter such as chicken manure. Egg producers in the United States address the Salmonella problem with eggs by concentrating on preventing the bacteria from entering through the shell. Towards this end, the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, mandates that all eggs be washed with water at a minimum temperature of 90 degrees Fahrenheit and at least 20 degrees warmer than the internal temperature of the egg at the time of washing. If it were colder than the egg, this could result in a very slight contraction, sucking in contaminated water through the shell's pores. The eggs will also be washed with some form of detergent and chemical sanitizer like chlorine, and then rinsed again and thoroughly dried, the latter further helping make sure the pathogens can't easily find their way through the egg's thousands of pores. After this, the eggs are often sprayed with some form of protective coating like mineral oil. Finally, the eggs are taken into a room where they are stored at temperatures at or below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. This effectively deals with the external sources of Salmonella and helps ensure you won't accidentally contaminate other foods with Salmonella from touching a contaminated eggshell, then touching other items as you prepare food. However, this does nothing to destroy any Salmonella potentially present within the egg. This is where the refrigeration comes in. By keeping the egg sufficiently cold, it mostly makes sure any Salmonella present will not multiply to sufficiently cause problems, given a couple-month shelf life, keeping the eggs safe to eat as long as they are cooked. Even for those eggs not internally contaminated with Salmonella, it's best to keep them refrigerated if they have previously been. As scientific advisor to the International Egg Commission, Vincent Guillenay notes, once you start refrigeration, you have to have it through the whole value chain from farm to store, because if you stop, if the eggs are cold and you put them in a warm environment, they're going to start sweating. The United Egg Producers Association further notes that condensation on eggshells facilitates the growth of bacteria that could contaminate the egg. So aren't Europeans getting food poisoning left, right, and center from eating contaminated eggs? Well, they use other methods to keep the Salmonella problem in check and don't refrigerate them at any point, though they do recommend eggs be stored in transport and by supermarkets at specific temperatures. In the winter between 66.2 and 69.8 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 19 to 21 degrees Celsius, and in the summer between 69.8 and 73.4 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 21 to 23 degrees Celsius. For starters, the European Union prohibits egg producers from washing their eggs. You see, shells have natural protection from Salmonella and other contaminants via a waxy surface known as the cuticle. The cuticle coats the shell, initially as a liquid when a hen lays the egg, and then it dries within minutes of being exposed to the air. Egg washing, when done properly, may eliminate surface contaminants, but it also washes away the cuticle and its natural protection, potentially allowing bacteria to get into the egg via its pores or hairline cracks. Both methods of eliminating external contaminants are quite effective, but the washing strategy requires that the eggs are processed in a very precise way for it to be effective. If eggs are allowed to sit in dirty washing water too long after losing the cuticle, this would be an ideal situation for microbes to quickly infect the inside of the eggs. Thus, the EU and others deem it safer to cut out the potentially error-prone middleman and simply leave the cuticle on. Of course, by not washing the eggs at all, the occasional egg with feces and other such things will pop up, the egg being laid via the same hole the chicken poops through, and the laying area potentially not being perfectly clean. But the fact that visibly dirty eggs will most definitely turn off some customers, and that European Union egg farmers aren't allowed to wash eggs, is actually seen as a net positive by some. For instance, Britain's Egg Industry Council's chief executive, Mark Williams, states of this, "In Europe, the understanding is that prohibiting the washing and cleaning of eggs actually encourages good husbandry on farms. It's in the farmer's best interests, then, to produce the cleanest eggs possible, as no one is going to buy their eggs if they're dirty." Unfortunately, in this scenario, you'll still get the occasional egg with fecal matter on it. This also increases the chances of cross-contamination with handling the potentially contaminated eggshells and then perhaps touching other food items without washing your hands. But both of these problems are easily solved by simply washing the eggs and your hands directly before using them. This do-nothing method also saves an amazing amount of effort and cost in the processing of the eggs. It's also a superior method of keeping eggs as safe as possible in areas where end consumers don't necessarily have refrigerators, as well as helps minimize the risk of egg contamination if a customer has a long drive home from the supermarket, which potentially allows the cold eggs to form condensation, giving pathogens easier access to the inside. So the cuticle solves the problem of external sources contaminating the inside of the egg, but how does the EU and other countries that don't refrigerate their eggs deal with eggs that were contaminated while being formed inside the chicken? Well, they mandate that their egg-laying chickens must be vaccinated against salmonella, among other requirements, if they are to receive the Lion Quality Code of Practice seal. The result is that approximately 90% of chicken eggs sold in Britain come from vaccinated hens, with the other 10% coming from small farmers who don't typically sell eggs through major retailers. So, which way of storing eggs produces fewer cases of salmonella-induced food poisoning? As the aforementioned Vincent Guinaud notes, they're different approaches to basically achieve the same result. We don't have massive food safety issues on either side of the Atlantic. Both methods seem to work. Well, that's great, but what about the actual numbers? Well, it seems there have never been any definitive studies, at least that we could find, but it would seem on the surface that the European method is the winner. However, of course, there are uncontrolled factors that could potentially be skewing the numbers here, so do take this with a rather large grain of salt. On average, there are approximately 142,000 cases of egg-related salmonella poisoning in the United States every year, according to the US Department of Agriculture. This is approximately 1 in 2,200 people infected every year, give or take, depending on whether an individual is a repeat offender in a given year. In contrast, in England and Wales in 2009, there were just 581 cases of egg-related salmonella poisoning, or about 1 in 95,000. Notably, before the British started vaccinating their chickens in the late 1990s in response to a major egg-induced salmonella outbreak, in 1997 there were 14,771 cases of egg-related salmonella poisoning in England and Wales, or about 1 in 3,700. You might be wondering why it simply isn't mandated that the United States egg producers vaccinate their chickens then. Well, this is primarily because when the last batch of rules concerning this very thing was put together, the limited number of large sample size studies available indicated vaccination wasn't an effective way to stop the internal contamination of salmonella in eggs. More recent vaccination methods and studies have produced entirely different results. Because of this, and the fact that hen houses and eggs are now continually tested for salmonella, approximately 1/3 to 1/2 of all egg producers in the United States have voluntarily begun vaccinating their chickens. This voluntary adoption of vaccines was also spurred on in response to a 2010 egg-related salmonella poisoning outbreak in the United States, which resulted in 500 million eggs needing to be recalled. To avoid such problems, more and more US egg farmers are jumping on board the hen vaccination train every year. In the end, while there are pros and cons of each method of keeping eggs contaminant-free, both have proven extremely effective when properly executed, though seemingly the European method has a large edge in terms of keeping people from getting sick. However, if you've got a refrigerator handy, it is superior in one regard. Eggs that are not refrigerated have a shelf life of about 3 weeks. Those stored in a typical consumer's refrigerator are generally good for about 2 months, and drastically longer given better regulated temperatures, something that used to be key to keeping eggs on supermarket shelves year-round. The reason for this is that naturally most chickens will stop laying eggs in the winter as a response to shorter daylight hours. There is a photoreceptive gland in the chicken's eye that, when exposed to sufficient light, ultimately triggers the release of the hormone that in turn spurs egg production when present in sufficient quantities in that hen. This created an egg supply problem that used to be solved by egg farmers in the United States by keeping the eggs at the perfect, constant chilled temperature not found in your normal consumer refrigerator, which is regularly being opened and closed. This allowed egg producers to store eggs for as much as a year, according to United Egg Producers Vice President of Government Relations, Howard Maguire. Today, of course, the problem is somewhat controversially solved with artificial light and strictly controlled egg production environments, with the egg finding its way from hen to consumer, generally in just a couple of weeks, regardless of what time of year it is. And now for a bonus fact. Ever wonder what the difference between brown eggs and white eggs is? Well, want to know more? Well, some people say that brown eggs are better for you and contain more nutrients, or that brown eggs taste better, or brown eggs are better for cooking things like quiches, while white eggs are better for baking cakes, etc., etc. The truth is that the difference between brown eggs and white eggs are that brown eggs are brown, while white eggs are white. How the rumors started about brown eggs being better is thought to be because they are often more expensive in supermarkets. This is, in part, because the hens that lay them usually eat more, which means the hens cost more to keep per egg. You see, white eggs are most often laid by white or light-colored hens with white earlobes, while brown eggs are most often laid by red-feathered or brown and dark-feathered chickens with red earlobes. This is not a universal truth, just a general rule. Further, the chicken's earlobes are really the indicator here, not the feathers, but there is a very strong correlation between earlobe color and feather color, so feather color can be a decent indicator too. Ultimately, egg color is determined by genetics, but the earlobe feather color thing is a good, though slightly flawed indicator. In the end, red-lobed chickens tend to be larger than their white-lobed counterparts, which is why they eat more. The farmers need to get reimbursed for the extra feed somehow, so the price of the brown eggs goes up. This also explains why white eggs tend to be more popular in supermarkets. White-lobed chickens cost less for farmers to keep, which leads to cheaper eggs, which leads to grocers buying more white eggs to put on the shelves to offer this product cheaper to customers. White eggs are just simply more cost-effective. As for the supposed difference in taste and nutritional content, there isn't one, with one caveat, though it isn't anything to do with the color of the egg. Rather, it has to do with the chicken's diet. Many chickens raised at home are brown egg layers, while most of the chickens raised for commercial use are white egg layers. The different diets affect the taste of the eggs and even the color of the yolk, similar to how diet can drastically affect the taste of the meat of some animal. However, if you were to take one of these brown egg-laying chickens and raise it on the same food as a white egg-laying chicken, their eggs would taste the same and be otherwise indistinguishable aside from the color of the shell. If their diets are the same, the yolks will even be identical in color. Today, chickens raised for commercial purposes, whether layers of white eggs or brown, are all getting fed the same thing, with perhaps just a slight variance from company to company. If you've had some brown eggs from a neighbor or a chicken of your own that's fed a different diet than commercially fed chickens, then there may be a difference in taste. It just doesn't have anything to do with the color of the egg. Of course, these days, some of the most hotly debated arguments aren't over white versus brown eggs, but over the superior quality of organic versus not organic eggs, or free-range versus cage eggs. While differences in diet can affect the taste, if you're wondering about quality of the egg or nutritional value, a study done by D.R. Jones et al. Through the Agricultural Research Service and published in Poultry Science in 2010 found that ultimately there is very little difference in the quality of eggs produced in these different ways. The small differences they did find varied, without one egg type consistently maintaining the highest or lowest values. On June 8, 2017, Greek-born Canadian-bred pizza maker Sam Panopoulos died. His career slinging pies was rather unremarkable, save for one notable thing. He was the inventor of the popular yet infamous pineapple-topped Hawaiian Pizza, named as such because of the brand of canned fruit he used. Loved by some and hated by others, the sweet and salty pizza is so controversial that it once triggered an argument between friendly nations. While arguments rage on both sides, the fact is that the Hawaiian pizza is actually not Hawaiian at all, but it's Canadian. And now here is the man who decided to put pineapple on top of a pizza. Sam Panopoulos left his Greek home with his two brothers in 1956 at the age of 20, bound for a new life in North America. However, on the boat ride over, they made a pit stop, one that forever changed Panopoulos' life and pizza history. Getting off the boat in Naples, Italy, Panopoulos was overwhelmed by the sights, sounds, and smells of a city known for its food. But that wasn't the case with its pizza. According to the Washington Post, Panopoulos' first ever bite of pizza was something of a spaghetti-like concoction that left him disappointed in the food item. Truth be told, pizza at that point had never really been considered a delicacy in the Naples food scene. It is often claimed to have been invented in the 8th century, though this is a matter of debate as it depends on your definition of what pizza is. If you choose to loosely define pizza as flatbread with toppings strewn on it, there is evidence that the Persian army around the 5th and 6th century centuries BC, used their shields to cook flatbread in this way while they were out in the field. The soldiers would then cover the bread with things like cheese and dates to make a quick meal. Further, it is very likely that people have been putting various toppings like cheese on bread as long as there has been cheese and there has been bread, which is a really long time. You can see our video on the history of cheese and the history of toast for more information on that one. However, some argue that these many references to ancient forms of pizza aren't truly pizza as we think of it today. So now let's fast forward a little. Mount Vesuvius leveled Pompeii on August the 24th, 79 AD. So why is this important when we're talking about the history of pizza? Well, archaeologists excavating the site have uncovered flat cakes made of flour that were a popular staple of the diet of the inhabitants in Pompeii and nearby Neapolis. Neapolis was a Greek settlement that later became Naples. Shops were also found in Pompeii that contained equipment and tools that would be consistent with those used in pizzerias. As for pizza recipes, around this time, we're actually lucky enough to have a cookbook of Marcus Gavius Apicius. It contains several recipes that instruct the cook to put various ingredients on a flat bread base. One recipe specifically calls for chicken, garlic, cheese, pepper, and oil to be placed on flat bread, which is about as close as you can get to a modern pizza without the now traditional tomato sauce. The reason they lacked tomato sauce at this point was because at this point in history, tomatoes were only found in America. By the early 1500s, though, tomatoes had found their way over from the New World to Europe. The tomato did not receive a warm welcome in its new home, though. Rather, it was greeted with disdain and sometimes outright fear. There were even rumors circulated that tomatoes were poisonous. Interestingly, a similar thing happened with potatoes as well, with this tuber not becoming widely popular until some clever tricks and antics by a Frenchman who managed to convince the masses that potatoes were fine to eat. You can see our video on the history of French fries for more on that one. So this all brings us back to Naples. Now, not long after the tomato was introduced to Europe, the poor folk of Naples added the demonized tomatoes to their pizza. This adding of the tomato sauce to pizza is considered by many to be the birth of the modern pizza, and it was known as a Neapolitana pizza, which is a flatbread topped with tomato sauce and cheese. Often bought from street vendors, Professor of History at the University of Denver, Dr. Carol Helstowski, in her book Pizza, A Global History, notes pizza at the time was considered a weekday food because it was cheap and helped people save money for their Sunday macaroni. To quote, "It was a cuisine of scarcity. Whatever you had, you tossed it on. Garlic, anchovies, and other little fish bits." In the 1830s, American Samuel Morse of Morse code fame visited Naples and looked upon the pizza being sold with disgust. A species of most nauseating cake, like a piece of bread that had been taken reeking of the sewer. This sentiment about pizza seemed to be the norm for quite some time among the affluent. As to how it spread to be a popular dish among those who weren't poor, a very popular myth, of which there are a few variations, is that in 1889 King Umberto and his cousin Marguerite, and also his queen, were traveling in the country in the hopes of calming the advancing tide of revolution in a newly reunited Italy. They arrived in Naples after many long nights on the road, eating the same fancy food, much of it French-inspired. Tired of overly rich dinners, the queen demanded something simpler, a commoner's meal. So she was delivered 3 pizzas by the famed pizza maker Raffaele Esposito. One of these was supposedly a new concoction of mozzarella, tomato sauce, and basil. The queen, she loved it so much that she popularized it among the elite, with the chef himself naming that particular pizza after her, hence Pizza Margherita, and Esposito often being dubbed the father of modern pizza, or so the story goes. The truth is that pizza made in that exact way was already present going back almost a century before this supposed event. On top of that, in 1849, such a dish is noted by Emmanuel Rocco, with it stated that the mozzarella should be arrayed out in a flower shape over the sauce, which gives it an alternate potential origin to the name of this particular pizza, with Margherita meaning daisy. That said, it is always possible that the Queen really did order such a dish from Esposito. As evidence to support this event having actually occurred, a thank you letter from the Queen herself with the official royal seal is seen on display to this day at the Pizzeria Brandy, once owned by the descendants of Esposito. Esposito is also known to have received permission to display the royal seal in his shop. Unfortunately, upon closer scrutiny, Raffaele Esposito received the aforementioned permission in 1871 for a shop that sold wine rather than a pizzeria. Then there's the problems with the letter he supposedly received from the Queen in 1889. Beyond no record of such a letter being sent in the palace archives, which do still have records for many other mundane correspondence that occurred that day, including even noting the paying of a washerwoman on the day in question, the royal seal on the letter is only similar to the real deal and very clearly was stamped on, not printed, as was the case for actual royal correspondence at the time. Further, rather than official stationery normally used by the Queen, this letter had handwritten on it, House of Her Royal Majesty. Comparison between actual letters from the Queen and this one also show a difference in handwriting, general format, and signature. The smoking gun, however, is the fact that the person who wrote the letter started it off by writing, Dear Mr. Rafael Esposito Brandy. Rafael Esposito never went by his wife's maiden name. Who did go by that name was Esposito's brother-in-law's sons, who took over Esposito's restaurant in 1932 and renamed it from Pizzeria of the Queen of Italy, the name Esposito had given it a decade before the supposed Queen event, to Pizzeria Brandy. After they took over the establishment, according to historian Dr. Antonio Mattozzi, they attempted in a variety of ways to connect the restaurant's history with eminent guests. Had they gone with Esposito's actual name, the connection between themselves, their restaurant, and their famed pizza-making uncle wouldn't have been clear to patrons. In any event, putting aside the cute little Queen popularization myth, in truth it would seem the popularity of various pizzas simply slowly spread from a dish of the poor to something most enjoy, all without any royal approval. Pertinent to the story at hand, pizza made its way to North America around the dawn of the 20th century, though only in a limited fashion. It wouldn't be until the 1950s that pizza would start to become widely known outside of the Italian-American community, thanks in part to certain Italian-American celebrities publicly enjoying the dish, and very notably Harry Warren and Jack Brooks's 1952 song, sung by Dean Martin on the soundtrack for the 1953 film The Caddy, That's Some More, which contained the famous line, When the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie, that's some more. And this all brings us back to Panopoulos. With his brothers, he arrived in the Ontario town of Chatham, about an hour's drive from the US and Michigan border, in 1956, where they opened a diner together. They called it The Satellite. It's still there, but under different management. What they served at this diner, well, it was rather eclectic. In an effort to distinguish their restaurant from others, Panopoulos & Co. began offering Chinese food. This was pretty foreign to North American palates at the time. They also offered things like burgers, Spanish rice with fried eggs, traditional Greek delicacies with bacon strips, and then came along pizza. As we just alluded to, and the man himself explained in an interview with the wonderful website we highly recommend you go check out, Atlas Obscura, pizza was a relatively unknown food in much of North America at the time, and particularly in Canada. According to Panopoulos, the only places nearby where people could get pizza was Windsor or Detroit, both about 50 miles from his restaurant. The pizza in Canada in those days was primitive, you know? Dough, sauce, cheese and mushroom, bacon, or pepperoni. That was it. You had no choices. You could get one of the three toppings, or more of them together. Again, attempting to distinguish his fare, he served customers pizza with things like Vienna sausage, rice, olives, and anchovies, just like in Naples. But it wouldn't be until 1962 when he first put pineapple on ham and a pizza and called it Hawaiian, with Panopoulos claiming he named it after the brand of canned pineapple that he had taken off the shelf. As for his inspiration here, Panopoulos noted, those days nobody was mixing sweets and sours and all that. The only sweet and sour thing you would get is Chinese pork, you know, with the sweet and sour sauce. Otherwise, there was no mix. As they were already serving such Chinese food with good results, he thought they should attempt to find other sweet and sour mixes. With regards to such an experiment with pizza, he stated, "We just put it on just for the fun of it, see how it was going to taste. We were young in the business and we were doing a lot of experiments." It also helped, and perhaps partially inspired him, that it was in the 1950s and 1960s when not only was pizza beginning to come into its own in North America, but a very Americanized version of tiki culture was also sweeping through the region. It properly started with millions of young men returning home from the Pacific Theater after experiencing South Pacific culture for the first time. Soon, barrels of rum, girls in hula skirts, and tiki torches were a popular, entertaining form of escapism and relaxation. Of course, the North American version of tiki culture, then and now, bears little resemblance to the real thing, and the actual origins are very religious in nature. Stores began advertising pineapples as a way to add a tropical dash to everyday life. So it's probably no surprise that Panopoulos' Hawaiian Pizza, debuting at this time, saw his customers quite literally eat it up, though Panopoulos noted nobody liked it at first, but after that they went crazy about it. Panopoulos would ultimately sell his restaurant in 1972, and in interviews shortly before his death he lamented that he hadn't attempted to patent Hawaiian Pizza. And now for a bonus fact. It is claimed by some that famed German TV chef Clemens Wilmenrod is actually the inventor of the Hawaiian pizza, as he introduced Toast Hawaii to the world on his show in 1955. However, this seems like a bit of a stretch. Beyond the fact that it is unequivocally Panopoulos' Hawaiian pizza that popularized the dish, Toast Hawaii is considered more of an open sandwich, comprising of a piece of toast topped with ham, cheese, pineapple, and a cherry on top. The sandwich is then grilled until the cheese melts. So there's this rather persistent idea that reboiling water, i.e. boiling water 2 or more times and allowing it to cool in between while making a cup of tea, is potentially harmful to your health, with some going so far as stating that regularly doing this even drastically increases your chances of getting cancer. The general reasoning behind why this is purportedly the case goes something like this. When we boil water, the chemistry of it changes, which is usually a good thing as it boils out volatile compounds and dissolves gases. This is why boiling water mostly ensures that it's safe to drink. If water is left boiled for too long or is reboiled, the chemical compounds change for the worst. By leaving your water to boil down, you're actually concentrating many harmful chemicals instead of getting rid of them. The same thing happens when you reboil water, as the compounds concentrate and increase the risk of ingesting certain chemicals. The website we gleaned this particular quote from goes on to suggest that reboiling water will expose you to toxic amounts of things like arsenic, fluoride, and nitrates, and even includes the words "reboiled water causes cancer" right there in the URL. Countless others concur, positing that consuming reboiled water is akin to drinking filthy bilge water filtered through a hobo's socks that have been previously stored at ground zero at Chernobyl. So, is it actually true that drinking reboiled water is actually bad for you? In short, well, no. At least not so long as your water is reasonably safe to drink in the first place and you aren't the victim of some wildly unrealistic scenario. Don't believe us? Well, keep on watching. To begin with, as we've already talked about in our video on why some ice cubes are cloudy and others are clear, the kind of water that pours freely from our faucets contains innumerable impurities, some of which are, at least from a practical standpoint for most home consumers, impossible to filter out entirely, such as nitrates. However, the concentration of these impurities is not generally particularly harmful in the normally negligible quantities that you find in common tap water. So, unless you currently happen to live in one of those places where the tap water catches fire or contains approximately the same concentration of lead as, well, pure lead, for the most part, your drinking water is probably pretty safe as is. So this brings us to the chief argument generally leveled against twice-boiled water. That's the concentration of impurities. When some of the water evaporates as the water boils, while some impurities are removed, others remain, called non-volatile substances, and are now more concentrated than when the volume of the liquid was greater. Yes, all of this is absolutely true. So you'd think at that point, well, case closed, right? Twice-boiled water is definitely bad for you. Except, well, this water is actually still not bad for you unless it was already bad for you to begin with, i.e. you have pre-existing problems with your drinking water. Why? Well, aside from the fact that you aren't likely letting the water boil down significantly before brewing your cuppa, in fact, many don't even bring the water to full boil before turning off the heat and pouring, even if you did, it wouldn't matter, except for in outlandishly unrealistic scenarios. You see, if you drank the entire teapot worth of water straight, say 5 mugs worth, rather than boiling it at all, it would not have hurt you, and would have contained more impurities than the same full teapot boiled down to 1 mug worth of water, as the impurities that would have been otherwise boiled off would still be present in the original 5 mugs of water. The key point here is that boiling the water does not add any impurities, it actually subtracts some. So whether 5 mugs worth of unboiled water or 1 mug from 5 boiled down, you still have mostly the same amount of impurities. The only real difference here is you'll be more hydrated if you drank the 5 mugs. Now, potentially, if you were always doing this and using tea as your primary hydration source, continually getting 5 times the impurities for 1 mug of water may be an issue depending on the purity of your water source, except even the biggest of tea drinkers aren't boiling off anywhere close to this amount of water when making tea, and the more tea you drink, the less will be evaporated off in between. Again, beyond that this is more an issue of time boiling and potential evaporation time rather than the number of boils, no one actually does this, not the least of which because, in the most extreme case, it would end up making your tea taste awful, and at a certain point, you'd likely even get noticeable sediment at the bottom of the kettle. In more realistic boiling scenarios, the extremely minuscule amount of extra impurities per mug isn't going to hurt you, and isn't likely to be something you'll taste the difference on. We've got more on that in a bit. But what about the state of the water the second time you boil it? Couldn't there be impurities being added in between. While it is possible that a kettle without a lid left sitting on the stove or counter might get a bit of dust or the like in the previously boiled water, the composition of it isn't likely to change much in the interim between boiling, outside of scenarios like a construction site or something like that. In most office buildings or your home, this isn't going to be an issue, and even less so if your kettle has a lid. Any microbes that find their way in there would likely be killed off during the boiling process, so there's no health issue there either. The only potential problem area left then would be the water picking up something from the kettle itself, but studies have shown that while things like iron and nickel and the like do leach into foods in exceptionally small quantities when you heat them in something like a stainless steel container, this is not so much the case when discussing leaching into tap water alone, particularly if you've used the container several times before, i.e. it's not new. Unsurprisingly, most kettles are made from extremely non-reactive substances, at least to tap water. Because of this, whether you boil the water once or several times, any impurities picked up from your kettle should be negligible in the vast majority of cases. If they're not, that's an issue with a faulty kettle and is likely an issue with once boiling water as well. Easy solution there is buy a better kettle. That said, if you brewed the tea in, for instance, the stainless steel kettle itself rather than your mug, then boil and let it sit, there will be some leaching similar to when cooking certain food items, with your mileage varying depending on what exactly the kettle is made from and what you're putting into the tea. But when discussing using that brewed water later for reboiling and brewing again, this once again gets into the realm of nobody does that. This certainly isn't the scenario people are talking about when discussing that it is bad to use twice boiled water. This is not to mention the fact that the impurities picked up from the kettle aren't necessarily inherently bad for you at the quantities we're talking about here. Indeed, some of these things might actually be good for you, such as if you're low on iron and getting iron leached from the kettle. In the end, there's a reason not a single public health agency in the world advises against drinking twice boiled water. Outside of elaborate scenarios that no one actually does, kettles that are dangerous to boil water in even once, or water that already has unsafe levels of some compound, twice or thrice boiled water is not going to cause you any harm. Another argument often leveled against the idea of using twice boiled water in tea is that it supposedly affects the taste. Now, as a Brit, I can tell you that some people take making tea very seriously and feel there is a genuine art to making a good cup. However, the idea of what exactly constitutes a good cup of tea, like your favorite Power Ranger perhaps, varies dramatically from person to person. For reference, the co-author of this piece, Carl Smord of Fact Fiend fame, you may know him, personally is quite partial to Builder's tea, and indeed also the Green Power Ranger. Builder's tea is a colloquial term used to refer to tea that is strong, milky, and loaded with sugar, all things that real tea drinkers would consider an affront to their very sense of being, preferring nothing less than the finest Lapsang Souchong filtered through the silken robes of a well-toned Shaolin monk. As for the other author of this piece, Davin, if you've ever watched our Brain Food Show live streams, you'll know that his favorite is Earl Grey with nothing added. Not because he likes Earl Grey or indeed tea at all, but rather so that he can say Earl Grey hot at his kettle, then make replicator sounds and drink it out of one of his Picard cups. Unsurprisingly, there are quite literally arguments on every part of the tea-making process, up to and including whether or not it's okay to clean the teapot that you use to make it. As an example of the kind of hearty debate the topic inspires, one of the most controversial things George Orwell ever wrote was an article aptly titled A Nice Cup of Tea, in which he, amongst other things, mocked the idea of putting sugar in tea, saying, "How can you call yourself a true tea lover if you destroy the flavor of your tea by putting sugar in it?" He also insisted that milk should be added after the tea. This latter is arguably one of the most common points of contention amongst tea drinkers, inspiring everything from comedic raps to actual scientific studies. For the curious, science says that milk should be added first because if you don't, the hot water causes the milk to heat unevenly, which causes the proteins to denature, meaning they lose their structure and clump, affecting the taste, whereas the rapper, one Doc Brown, says that you must be out of your mind to put the milk in first, adding that doing so makes his heart burst. Needless to say, when discussing what is better tasting tea or not, science and what George Orwell think have little to no bearing. You just like what you like after all. Okay, so let's now talk about the twice boiling tea part and that it purportedly ruins the taste of the tea. Beyond the subjectivity of such a statement, the funny thing is it's not actually clear that twice boiling water does affect the taste of tea. While, as we mentioned, in an extreme case of doing something crazy like boiling down 20 liters of water to a single cup's worth will undisputedly drastically affect the taste of the tea due to concentration of impurities, when talking about a more realistic scenario of something like twice or thrice boiled water that barely has any of it evaporated off in between, and generally fresh water added before each boiling, diluting the mixture, it's not so clear there is a difference in taste happening, other than perhaps in people's heads. While we could not find any studies on the idea of twice boiled water changing the taste of tea, we can at least look at the mechanism involved to get an idea of whether it's likely or not that such a taste shift is occurring. For starters, many claim the taste difference comes about due to twice boiled water having less dissolved oxygen in it, referencing the fact that as the water temperature increases, the solubility of oxygen decreases. This latter fact, absolutely true, the former, though, is not. You see, at 100 degrees Celsius, boiling point, the concentration of dissolved oxygen, assuming normal atmospheric pressure, will ultimately be near zero, whether it's once or 10th boiled water. How long you boil the water does come into play somewhat, but even then the differences are minimal, with dissolved oxygen levels at 1 atmosphere and 0 degrees Celsius on the order of 15 parts per million, compared to approximately 5 parts per million at 50 degrees Celsius and near 0 parts per million at 100. But my tea-tasting palate is extremely refined and able to detect even the smallest of changes of dissolved oxygen levels, you might say while idly cleaning your monocle. Once the water is allowed to cool back down, its dissolved oxygen levels will once again begin to rise to normal levels given atmospheric pressure and temperature. CO2 levels, which can affect the taste, will also return to normal. Given this, the second time you bring water back up to the boil, things like oxygen level are not going to be any different than the first, assuming equal boiling points and or temperature levels. That's not to mention that the idea that more oxygen equals better tasting gets into the aforementioned debate on what does or does not taste better when making tea. Everyone's got their own preferences. And if you're curious, there have been studies, Pangborn and Bertolero 1972, Forst Ali 1998, that have indicated that dissolved oxygen doesn't actually noticeably impact the flavor of water, though it should be noted that both of those studies weren't dealing with brewing tea, and it is possible, even probable, that dissolved oxygen could be interacting with elements of the tea to change the flavor, similar to what happens with wine. But either way, whether once, twice, or thrice boiled, you're getting essentially the same dissolved oxygen levels, assuming you boil and steep the same way each time. Another factor in twice boiled water that may affect the flavor is higher concentration of impurities, which, as we already discussed in realistic tea-making scenarios, isn't actually going to be much different than once boiled water. The only thing left would be the water picking up something from the kettle itself that affects the flavor, but again, as previously mentioned, studies have shown that while things like iron and nickel and the like do leach into foods in exceptionally small quantities while you heat them in something like a stainless steel container, this is not so much the case when discussing leaching in water alone. The bottom line on all of this is that whatever your position on whether twice boiled water does or does not affect the taste of tea, and if so, if it makes it taste better or worse to you, widespread claims, even from otherwise reputable sources, that seem to imply twice boiled water will somehow give you possibly even cancer is simply not correct. Twice boiled water simply isn't bad for you at all, unless your particular water source was already bad for you at the once boiled level. Unless you've managed to make it this far in life without setting foot in a store, you're probably aware that Jello, or probably known as jelly by British people like myself, is a genericization of the brand Jello, which itself was derived from the word gelatin. Gelatin is a protein derived from collagen via a process called hydrolysis. This is a process that breaks apart the bonds of this protein with water. While hydrolysis may sound complicated, it's actually a simple matter of boiling collagen-rich animal byproducts, usually bones, connective tissue, and skin, in water for many hours in order to break it down. The resulting broth is then carefully strained before the water is evaporated, leaving behind gelatin, which can either be pressed into sheets or sold as a powder. Given that it is made from animal byproducts, gelatin and products containing it aren't considered to be vegetarian, and as a result, there are several plant-based alternatives, such as agar derived from algae and carrageenan derived from seaweed, available on the market. You can actually see our video on why seaweed is sometimes used in the making of ice cream to learn more about that. Though commonly thought of as being modern, gelatin-based foodstuffs have existed since at least the 15th or 16th centuries. Notably, in the late 17th century, a Frenchman named Denis Papin invented a device he dubbed the digester of bones. Marketing genius on that one, Papin. Papin's original invention was to create a device not too dissimilar from a modern pressure cooker, which utilized steam in order to boil down bones either for thickening gravies or creating a paste that could be readily consumed by the poor. Despite his noble intentions for the less than affluent among us, the device ended up being too expensive for all but the wealthiest individuals to afford. In the end, the French and eventually the English elite became enthralled with the jellies that it produced, with one English observer noting, "The hardest bones of beef and mutton were made as soft as cheese, producing an incredible quantity of gravy, and for close of all, a jelly made from the bones of beef, which makes a good relish, the most delicious I have ever tasted." The English are also credited with creating one of the earliest recipes known that contains gelatin, a dish called calf's foot jelly, which was, unsurprisingly, made from calf's feet, though the feet of deer, sheep, or another similar animal could be substituted if necessary. The exact recipe states, take 2 calf's feet and add them to 1 gallon of water, boil down to 1 quart, strain, and when cold, skim off the fat, add this to the white of 6 or 8 eggs well beaten, a pint of wine, half a pound of sugar loaf, and the juice of 4 lemons, and let them be well mixed. Boil the whole for a few minutes, stirring constantly, and then strain through a flannel. This forms a very nutritious article of diet for the sick and for those recovering from disease. The wine may be omitted or added according to choice. Originally designed as a food for invalids, like many other gelatin-based foods, the dish became something of a delicacy among the upper classes. Later, its supposed high nutritional value saw various gelatin-based foods become popular with soldiers during the Napoleonic Wars. Alright, so where do pineapples come into this, and why can't you put them in Jello? Well, to begin with, it's not true that you can't put pineapples in Jello. You just shouldn't put unprocessed pineapples into it unless you like the Jello to stay in its liquid form. You see, since gelatin is a protein, it is very susceptible to breaking down into its amino acid building blocks when it encounters enzymes known as proteases. As a result of this breakdown, the proteins are unable to tangle together to create a partially solid structure. The bottom line is, without this linking, the Jello never sets. In regards to pineapples, they contain bromelain, which itself contains sulfur hydroprotease enzymes. As such, gelatin with unprocessed pineapple added to it will simply not set. However, since heating typically renders the protease enzymes in bromelain inactive, canned pineapple can be added to Jello as it is heated sufficiently as part of the canning process. So you might be wondering at this point if there are any other common foodstuffs that similarly prevent Jello from setting. Well, the short answer is yes. Anything containing protease enzymes is a no-no in your Jello. This includes several fruits such as papaya, mango, guava, papaw, and kiwi, as well as figs and ginger root. In addition to this, protease enzymes are also found in broccoli, mushroom, spinach, wheat, and soybeans, none of which you're very likely to add to Jello. But, well, at least you now know. Finally, meat tenderizer, which is usually made from either the aforementioned bromelain or papain derived from papayas, will, of course, stop Jello from setting. As with pineapple, however, if the food items in question are first heated sufficiently to inactivate the offending enzymes, in the case of bromelain, heated to above 70 degrees Celsius, that's 158 degrees Fahrenheit, they will then be fine to use in your latest Jello creation. And now for some bonus facts. Technically, Jello is actually alive. That's at least according to a 1974 experiment performed by Dr. Adrian Upton. Dr. Upton attached an EEG electroencephalogram machine to a dome of lime green Jello. The Jello produced alpha waves in much the same way an awake and alive human would do. This set the science world aflutter, But what Dr. Upton was really trying to prove is that an EEG should not be the only method used to determine if a human is alive or not. Because the reality is we all know that Jello is not alive. And now for another bonus fact. Since chemicals like bromelain break down protein, they're remarkably effective at tenderizing meat, and there's some tenuous evidence to support the idea that eating them can aid in the digestion of protein. Whether there is actually any positive effect or not, pineapple and similar protease-rich fruits have become popular with bodybuilders for this reason. There have been numerous deaths attributed to excessive caffeine ingestion, so if you happen to be a person who loves coffee and energy drinks, you might want to know approximately what amount you should avoid drinking on any given day. So, how much caffeine would actually kill you? I'm actually quite curious to know because I do not drink a small amount of coffee. Well, there are several factors that make this a tricky question to answer. For example, not everyone reacts the same way to caffeine. People also become tolerant to it, and so the effects can be different from person to person. Lastly, there would be no respectable researcher who would dare perform a study on humans if the goal of that study is the death of the person. Thus, as you might expect, we couldn't find any studies that show what amount of caffeine would definitely kill your average human. But that's not very interesting, is it? So let's dig a little deeper, shall we? First of all, what we did is we went and gathered 100 volunteers who were tired of living, along with some that we just found on the streets and figured they should be in quarantine, and we just decided to overdose them on caffeine and see what... Not really. But seriously, it does turn out there are less ethically questionable studies that have allowed doctors to understand what's going on inside the body in caffeine overdoses and approximately what dose would prove fatal for the average person. So while the exact dose is almost impossible to answer for a given individual, we can say for sure a few things, like that the highest caffeine dose ever known to be ingested by someone who survived it was around 100 grams. Although that might not sound like much, in terms of raw amount of caffeine, it should be noted that that's the amount of caffeine in about 1,200 cups of coffee. Lesser doses that are generally thought to put an adult at a high risk of death typically range from about 5 to 10 grams ingested in a short period, which is still an awful lot of energy drinks and coffee, though there are certain diet pills that can easily get you over that amount in just a handful of pills. Now, of course, people ingesting significantly lesser doses have had death attributed to caffeine overdose. That said, others survive where you'd think they wouldn't, such as one medical report looking at the case of an unnamed 1-year-old girl who ingested some of her mother's diet pills. The total dose of caffeine to the 1-year-old was approximately 3 grams. While said baby did have significant complications, including heart issues and seizures in the immediate aftermath, she survived the incident and did not seem to suffer any long-term issues. Noteworthy here is that due to her tiny size, the caffeine concentration in her system ended up being the second highest ever documented in someone who survived the event. But still, keep your diet pills out of reach of your kids, for God's sake. Yet another research paper we looked at documented the case of a 16-year-old boy who ingested around 6 to 8 grams of caffeine and also managed to survive despite a number of immediate medical complications as a result of the caffeine. So basically, there are a myriad of factors at play here, but as for a definitive dose that would kill most people, it turns out when talking cups of coffee or energy drinks, it's a huge amount in most people, with some exceptions where individuals with certain heart conditions and the like might want to avoid significantly smaller doses. As for the average Joe, most physicians and medical bodies tend to recommend avoiding ingesting more than around 500 to 600 milligrams of caffeine per day, not necessarily because you might die per se, but more because it's likely not going to be good for you for a variety of reasons, especially if done regularly. For reference, the average cup of coffee has in the range of 40 to 150 milligrams of caffeine. For example, a Starbucks 2X caffeine K-cup will get you a dose of around 260 milligrams. I'm fairly au fait with the Starbucks menu. I've never heard of a 2X caffeine K-cup. I guess it's an American thing, and that's an extraordinary amount of caffeine in it. This is compared to the normally caffeinated K-cup from the same brand, which has around 130 milligrams. Obviously, if you follow the recommendations, you'll want to avoid more than 2 of the 2X caffeine K-cups per day. For other references, 12 ounces of Jolt Cola has approximately 100 grams. Let me just put that into normal units. 12 ounces in mils. 12 ounces in mils. 354, so like just bigger than a regular can of Coke. For other references, 12 ounces, 350 basically, mils of Jolt Cola is approximately 100 milligrams, 16 ounces at about 160 milligrams, Monster Energy at about 160 milligrams, 12 ounces of Mountain Dew has 55 milligrams, and Dr. Pepper has 61 milligrams. So all of this might have you wondering how caffeine actually manages to kill. Caffeine is one of several naturally occurring substances known as xanthines. Xanthines are, among other things, I'm going to check the pronunciation on xanthines, because it's got an X at the beginning, which is always a bit weird. Xanthines. Xanthines. Come on. Tell me. Xanthines. Caffeine is one of several naturally occurring substances known as xanthine. Xanthines are, among other things, central nervous system (CNS) stimulants. Caffeine specifically is in over 60 known plant species. It's the most widely consumed psychoactive substance in the world. Depending on what study you read, approximately 80 to 90% of the US population consumes at least 200 milligrams per day. In low doses, it has many benefits that can help with things like pain management, water retention, alertness, and a general feeling of well-being, to name a few. As with most CNS stimulants, the higher the dose, the more profound this reaction. As you consume more caffeine, the risks do begin to outweigh the benefits. A person can become jittery, anxious, begin having high blood pressure, chest pain, headaches, dehydration, and unfortunately, dependence that causes withdrawal if you don't continue consuming it. Yeah, you know those mornings where it's like, you don't have a cup of coffee and it's like, why does my head hurt? Oh yeah, because I got a serious caffeine addiction. In toxic doses, caffeine can cause extremely low blood pressure, seizures, cardiac rhythm problems, and lactic acidosis. While there appears to be some dissension among researchers as to how exactly xanthines like caffeine cause the reactions they do, what is known is that they antagonize what are known as adenosine receptors within almost every cell in your body. Adenosine is a chemical present in every human cell. It combines with other chemicals like phosphate to create numerous compounds that help cells work properly. Those compounds need to attach their receptors to affect cells. There are 4 main groups of adenosine receptors within the body, and their effects can fall into 4 categories. Generally speaking, adenosine compounds help in increasing the oxygen available to cells, protect against the damage caused by a lack of oxygen, help in initiating the body's natural anti-inflammatory responses, and help in the creation of blood vessels. Caffeine is similar to adenosine in chemical composition, and as such can attach to adenosine receptors, not allowing adenosine compounds to perform normally. The result is CNS and cardiac stimulation, relaxation of the smooth muscles, and a diuretic action on the kidneys that can lead to dehydration. Thus, in high levels, caffeine can be very toxic. It will bind to adenosine receptor sites known as subtypes A1 and A2. The result is seizures. In high doses, it will also inhibit an enzyme known as phosphodiesterase while stimulating the release of neurotransmitters involved in your fight or flight nervous system. The result is extremely fast heart rates, dilation of your blood vessels causing low blood pressures, low potassium levels that can cause lethal heart rhythms, the breakdown of sugars in your liver, and an increase in your white blood cells. If all of that doesn't seem like it's deadly enough, kinda does, doesn't it? Those side effects will cause their own problems. Specifically, lactic acidosis will be caused by your body's tissues not getting enough oxygen because your blood pressure is too low. The results of your seizures, low oxygen levels within your cells, and inevitable calcium release from an area of your cells called your endoplasmic reticulum will give you what is known as rhabdomyolysis. This is the breakdown of your muscles, causing a release of your muscle fibers into your bloodstream. Brown pee and clogged kidneys then result, which is not a good time. If you're thinking, I'm never drinking that nectar from Satan again, do not worry, those toxic reactions won't happen at normal consumption levels. Thank God. Just, again, when you start getting in excess of 500 to 600 milligrams per day for a typical adult, you're going to start to have a bad time in many cases, and even less for the littles. And now for a bonus fact. Well, speaking of Satan, prior to being baptized in the 16th century by Pope Clement VIII, coffee had been thought by many Catholic leaders in Europe to be Satan's drink. Really? Satan's got good taste. Whether because of its characteristic dark color and bitter taste, both of which were the antithesis of sweet wine which was associated with the Eucharist and Christ, Its physical effects, or its roots in the Muslim world, or all three, many Catholic clerics were therefore solidly against the beverage. As to who first brewed the first cup of Joe, well, that isn't known, but that hasn't stopped many a fictitious origin story from popping up, such as the commonly repeated legends that coffee was first discovered in the 19th century by an Ethiopian herdsman, Kaldi, who noticed that one of his goats appeared to be particularly frolicsome after consuming some red coffee berries. Giving it a go himself, he soon felt more upbeat. Energized, he relayed his discovery to his neighbors, and coffee consumption was born. However, it really came to be discovered as a stimulant. Over time, coffee became popular throughout Ethiopia, where it was said the warriors of the Gala tribe mixed it with butter and ate it before going into battle. Eventually, by the 12th century, Arab traders returning to what is now Yemen from Ethiopia brought coffee with them and learned to cultivate the plant. By this point, the beans were being transformed into a drink by means of boiling. In the 15th century, Ottoman Turks brought coffee with them when they conquered Constantinople. At this same time, the Mufti of Aden, who had been suffering with an unidentified illness and was cured after drinking coffee for the first time, touted its beneficial qualities, which contributed to its popularity throughout the Muslim world. Also in the 15th century, the first coffee houses began appearing in Mecca and Constantinople, and like today, they were used not only for drinking coffee, but socializing as well. By the end of the 16th century, coffee was found in Venice, and by the turn of the 17th century, Catholic Church leaders were becoming suspicious of coffee and the effect it had on the local populace. Deciding it must be Satan's drink, many local clergy beseeched the Pope, asking him to prohibit its consumption. Trying it for himself, Pope Clement VIII, 1536 to 1605, found it agreeable, and demonstrating a gift for diplomacy, declared in 1600, "Why, this Satan's drink is so delicious that it would be a pity to let the infidels have exclusive use of it. We shall cheat Satan by baptizing it." With the Pope's blessing and its natural addictive qualities, coffee soon spread across Europe. Under Jewish dietary laws, eating pork in any form is strictly forbidden. Jesus Christ was Jewish, so why, on the anniversary of his resurrection, do people traditionally serve ham? You'll often read it's because ham is a supposedly Christian meat, able to be consumed by Christians, but not certain other prominent religious groups. However, the real reason is simply because it's in season. While modern food storage techniques in supermarkets with efficient and worldwide supply chains shield us from this fact somewhat, like fruits and vegetables, different meats also have seasons, and these depend on a variety of factors, including what the animals were eating and when and where they would be in their growth cycle, and, of course, the availability or lack of refrigeration. With pigs and cows before refrigeration, it simply made sense to slaughter them in the fall. Since it takes a fair amount of time to butcher a beast as large as a hog or a steer, the cold temperatures helped keep the meat from going bad before it could be properly prepared. Another consideration was taste. Shortly before slaughter in the fall, hogs would be fed things like apples and acorns that would greatly improve the flavor of the meat that they would ultimately provide. As one specialty pork producer noted, "The tradition of acorn-fed pork goes back millennia. The oak-nut was a diet staple because the pigs roamed and rooted about for acorns in the forests of Italy and Spain. An acorn diet is today best known as what makes the prized and pricey Ambon Iberico of Spain so succulent." Butchered in the fall, most hams were prepared and allowed to properly cure over the winter to further develop their flavor. This was a particularly important food source this time of year in some parts of the world where the rest of the stored meat would have already been eaten, with little other meat of any real quality available. This was the case in North America, where the other traditional spring meat, lamb, was and still is less in vogue, which is also why eating ham on Easter in North America is much more popular than other regions where Easter is celebrated. Conversely, like I said, in Europe, lamb is commonly served at Easter, and the tradition actually traces its origins to Jewish Passover feasts. This is also certainly fitting for Easter, with Jesus as the Lamb of God. Born shortly before the holiday, the animal may be slaughtered within 6 to 8 weeks and thus offers a fresh, as opposed to a cured option for Easter protein, when historically other such protein sources were scarce at this time of year. And now for some bonus facts. Eggs are popular at Easter, at least in part due to the fact that spring is the peak season for their production. As a result, eggs have been a part of spring celebrations since long before Easter was even a thing. For example, decorated eggs have been a part of the Iranian New Year, which is observed on the spring equinox for millennia. And now for another bonus fact. In addition to the refrigeration factor, like pigs, cows are also thought to be tastier when slaughtered in the fall. This is due apparently to the fact that the frost has killed flies and sweetened the grass, so the cows are more comfortable. Among other things, cows slaughtered when fatigued or in distress also negatively impacts the shelf life of the meat. And now for another bonus fact. Turkey is also tastiest in the fall because, as the weather cools and the days become shorter, their hormone levels shift and they fatten up. On the other hand, before industrialization, since most chicken eggs are laid in the spring, those that are allowed to grow into chickens are traditionally slaughtered in the summer. Leaving fruit to dry out in the sun is one of the oldest and earliest ways of preserving this variety of food. Our ancestors were the type to never waste anything edible, even if it sometimes passed its prime. Not only did dried fruit keep longer and take up less space than fresh fruit, it was also sweeter and, some would say, more flavorful. As the cultivation of grapes spread quickly throughout the ancient world, so did the popularity of raisins. It's impossible to pinpoint the exact time and place, but it's generally believed that grape cultivation originated in the area of modern-day Armenia and then expanded to the Tigris-Euphrates region around 4000 BCE. Which is now Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. The locals were already drying their native fruits, and they were probably more than happy to add grapes to their selection of date palms and figs. The Phoenicians brought the grape, and therefore the raisin, to Malaga and Valencia in Spain and Corinth in Greece. Drawings depicting grape cultivation were also showing up on tomb walls in Egypt from as far back as 2000 BC. As their popularity grew, so did their value as an object of trade. They were given as prizes, used for barter, and as a medicinal cure-all. Raisins were also seized as spoils of war and left as offerings to the dead. Alright, but let us get to the question. What about the seeds? How did the ancients deal with this huge issue before the advent of the miracle that is seedless grapes? Well, for starters, actually a type of tiny seedless grape used to make raisins and currants has been around since at least 75 AD, when Pliny the Elder wrote about them. This variety originated in Corinth in Greece, hence the name currant. Fast forward to 1836, and currants were the principal export from Greece. It was hugely popular in England, with the British using copious amounts in their cooking. However, by the early 1900s, the virtual Greek currant monopoly crashed, and many a Greek farmer tried their luck in America. Of course, seeded varieties of grapes were also used to make raisins, as often seedless grapes were much more expensive. As such, varieties like Muscat grapes, which were the bumper crop in Malaga and Valencia, were hugely popular for making raisins. These grapes were big and fruity, with large seeds to match. So, how did people use these seeded grapes for raisins? Well, they simply popped the seeds out through the grape skin first. This had the side benefit and also drawback of bringing the fruit's sugary nectar to the surface during the process, making for a very sweet and exceptionally sticky raisin. As to the exact methods, as these sorts of raisins tended to transport poorly, people often did the popping and raisin making themselves to reduce expense. There were several methods employed to get that tedious job done. One method was to heat the grapes in water to plump them up and then soften the skin before cutting them open and de-seeding them by hand. Not exactly a fun job. As such, there were also kitchen gadgets for de-seeding grapes. For instance, one popular model worked by first having the cook feed the grapes into the hopper at the top of the device. As the handle was cranked, the grapes were forced through two teethed rollers which exposed the seeds and forced them out one chute and the future raisin out of another. As you might imagine, even with the help of this little machine, making raisins was still a fairly tedious process. This would all change though when Muscat grapes lost their spot as the go-to raisin grape to a seedless grape variety. In the 1870s, just a decade or so after the first successful currant vineyard had been established in America, a vineyard owner named William Thompson imported a different type of seedless grape cutting that he purchased from Almira and Barry Nursery in New York, which he ultimately called Thompson Seedless. He gave some cuttings away to a neighbor, John Onstad, who realized that these new grapes had great commercial potential, being tasty table grapes, good for making wine, and also having the necessary attributes to make good raisins. They ripen relatively early, they're a decent size, they've got high sugar content, they transport well, and of course they are seedless. Thompson Seedless, which were later determined simply to be Sultanina grapes commonly grown before this in Asia Minor among other places, were soon the cornerstone of California's lucrative grape industry, with over 2 million cuttings of the plants being purchased by growers all over California within 20 years of Thompson planting that first cutting. Today these grapes are used in over half the raisins produced globally, around 90% of which are grown in California. As a result of the Thompson variety popping up and being grown en masse, helping to make seedless grapes and raisins more affordable, today Muscat raisins are typically as hard to find in your local supermarket as rotary phones. But Muscats are still prized by some for being tastier raisins than any available seedless variety. Also, relatively recently, a seedless variety of Muscat has been developed, so it may soon enjoy a resurgence in popularity. I guess we'll see. And now for a bonus fact. The word raisin ultimately derives from the Latin racemus, meaning quite literally a cluster of grapes. Whether a block, a cylinder, or a pyramid, a cheese's shape is dictated by concerns with pressure, salt, absorption, ripening, economics, and tradition. Cheeses that are made in wheels like creamy brie and camembert need equal rates of salt uptake, as well as even ripening action from its molds. The wheel shape facilitates both, as the consistent thickness encourages equal absorption as the surface flora spread, so the disc's shape keeps the mold from focusing too much on one area. Another reason to make a cheese in a wheel, at least historically, is pressure. For example, for traditional rind-covered cheddars, the dry salting method used in their production needs quite a bit of pressure to hold the curd together until it is able to stick on its own. The round molds provide extra strength in pressing, where rectangular molds of the same thickness, even stainless steel ones, tend to lose their shape and even split at the seams over time. As one professional cheesemaker noted on the durability of these molds, design engineers who know cheese plants typically design the item, then double it. A third reason for making cheese into a wheel, particularly for those produced in mammoth proportions, is that you can just roll the large wheel rather than lugging it about. Historically, cheese wheels were often made in these very large sizes for sale in marketplaces, and if you wanted to buy cheese from the market, you used to have to ask the seller to cut off the amount you wanted from these very large wheels rather than have the cheese you wanted to buy pre-packaged in consumer-sized portions. If none of these issues are a concern, then making cheese in a block, often from large blocks that are then cut into smaller blocks for consumer usage, is often a wise choice, as blocks are easier and more economical to stack, store, and transport over long distances. Other shapes are used as well, sometimes as much to do with tradition as anything else, thanks to modern cheesemaking equipment and environmental controls, pretty much meaning you can use whatever shape you might want. These traditional shapes include cylinders and pyramids, which are very popular with goat's milk cheeses. In fact, in France, the shape of a goat's milk cheese tells savvy consumers instantly where their cheese originated. For example, the flat disc of Banon is known to originate in Provence, while a log of the mild and creamy Montrachet comes from Burgundy, and the striking cheese of Valence, called either Valence or Pyramide, is instantly recognizable for its flat-topped pyramidal shape, and is loved, by the way, for its mildly nutty flavor. And now for some bonus facts. There are several molds that are used in cheese making depending on the desired product. In addition to pecan bertie and pecan didum, a number of other species of penicillium are used as well. For example, to make blue cheeses including Blue, Stilton, Gorgonzola, and Roquefort, either P. roqueforte or P. glaucum are employed. Able to thrive with little oxygen, these molds work their way through the small cracks inside a ripening cheese. Notably, to encourage even more blue-veined goodness, some cheesemakers actually inject their cheeses with additional mold. Not just restricted to molds, bacteria play a large part in cheese production as well. Vital to the initial formation of a cheese, lactic acid bacteria such as lactococci and lactobacilli eat the milk's sugar, lactose, and help convert it into lactic acid. Although these early bacteria often die off early in the process, for some cheeses like Gruyere and others, some of these bacteria survive to help produce these cheeses' unique properties. In addition, other bacteria may play a role later in the cheese's metamorphosis. For example, Propionibacter shamani eat acetic acid and produce carbon dioxide, and they're used in making Swiss and Emmental cheeses, where they are key to producing their unique flavors and making those trademark holes. Another bacteria, Brevibacter linens, is used to make some truly smelly but delicious cheeses like Limburger. Breaking down proteins into pungent, smelly, tempting aromas like onion and garlic, B. linens requires continuous washing and wiping of the surface, or smearing, hence the category smear bacteria, to keep the bacteria alive. If the smearing is continued during the entire maturation process, a stinking cheese is produced, but if the washing is stopped midway, the cheese is much milder. On that note, in 2004, researchers at Cranfield University used a machine fitted with sensors that were able to detect the different smelly chemicals of stink, as well as the contributions of 19 humans who sacrificed their noses, to determine that Vieux Bologna was the absolute stinkiest of all the cheeses. The genesis of Sriracha hot sauce becoming the condiment staple that it is today can be traced back to 1975 and an unassuming Vietnamese refugee called David Tran, the co-founder and current CEO of Huy Fong Foods. Following the Vietnam War, Tran, who was a major in the South Vietnamese army and otherwise made his living making sauces, fled Vietnam with his family in December of 1978, along with 3,317 other refugees aboard a Taiwanese freighter called the Huy Fong, meaning gathering prosperity. This is a name that he'd later anglicize and use as the name of his massive, spicy empire. Like many successful businessmen, Tran made his fortune by noticing a consumer demand that was going unfulfilled and filling it. In this case, it all started with a demand for hot sauce among the many Southeast Asian immigrants in Los Angeles. More specifically, Tran got his start in the US by making a sauce he called pepper satay, a sauce he literally made in a bucket and bottled in recycled baby food jars, and he sold via bicycle and later out of a blue Chevy van. Tran noted, "I started the business with my eyes closed. There were no expectations at all. My American dream was never to become a billionaire. We started this business because we like fresh, spicy chili sauce." Having a modicum of success in the industry, he began experimenting with local ingredients, eventually creating a slight variation of a Thai recipe he liked that used, to quote, hybrid jalapeno peppers, vinegar, sugar, salt, and garlic. He named his version of this sauce Sriracha, after the coastal town Sriracha in Thailand, where the base recipe he tweaked originated. Recipe perfected, he began selling his Sriracha sauce alongside his pepper satay. To quite literally put his stamp on his sauces like he had done previously in Vietnam, Tran attached a label with a rooster on every bottle of sauce that he sold. The reason he chose a rooster as a symbol of his company is because the year he was born, 1945, was the year of the rooster, according to the Vietnamese zodiac. As for who designed the now famous logo, not even Tran knows, and he credits the original drawing, which he has long since lost, to an unnamed Vietnamese street artist he met in the 1970s. As Tran quipped, "I never thought I'd be successful, so I didn't keep any of my souvenirs." Speaking of branding and failing to plan for success, while the exact rooster logo cannot be copied by other companies legally, though many a company makes exceptionally similar bottles and logos for their Sriracha sauce to trick people into thinking it's Huy Fong brand, Tran didn't bother trademarking the name Sriracha, so any company can call their product that without fear of being sued. Given how popular the sauce has become, such copying is now common practice. For instance, even the likes of Taco Bell has jumped on the Sriracha knockoff train. The noted fast food chain chose to come up with their own version of the sauce rather than just use the original Sriracha, despite in some of the ads showing the Huy Fong Sriracha bottle design and referring to their Sriracha as the rooster sauce. In their case, their decision not to use Tran sauce is somewhat inexplicable, as Huy Fong hasn't increased the wholesale price of Sriracha since Tran originally made it in the 1970s, meaning it's relatively cheap, and Tran states he doesn't charge royalties to use his sauce in this way. Because of this, many restaurant chains just go with the original rather than use the many knockoffs, or indeed make their own. Of the Taco Bell situation, Tran laments, "For us, it's a disappointment if people think it's our product." Nevertheless, he states he doesn't regret not trademarking the name, noting that it's basically free advertising when major companies like Taco Bell do this. Tran states, "We have lawyers come and say, 'I can represent you and sue,' and I say, no, let them do it." He also believes that his company still make the best Sriracha, for reasons we'll get to shortly, so customers will eventually buy his product in his opinion. Alright, so back to the hot sauce and the early 1980s. Tran was still selling his sauce from the back of the aforementioned van that he had personally hand-painted a large version of his rooster logo on. But by 1980, his budding sauce empire had grown to require a 5,000 square foot, that's about 460 square meter warehouse, which he rented in LA's Chinatown. At this point, he was making not just pepper satay and Sriracha, but also chili garlic, sambal badyak, and sambal olek. In the few decades since, the company has expanded to a sprawling facility in Irwindale comprising a massive 650,000 square foot, that's about 60,000 square meter building. The location of this facility is critical as, unlike pretty much every other major hot sauce maker on the planet, Tran has always insisted that his hot sauce be made using fresh rather than dried chilies. To this end, all the chilies used to create his Sriracha hot sauce are processed within a day of being picked. Because of this, they only make new vats of the sauce at certain times of year, and Tran must source his chilies from a local farm, in this case located just an hour away from his factory in Irwindale. Tran reports his choice of using local products, including buying the other ingredients like salt, sugar, and vinegar from US companies, is not because of the freshness only, but is also a way to pay back the United States for being the only country that would grant him asylum when he was fleeing Vietnam. As you might expect, being restricted to just one local supplier is a major problem for Huy Fong, as they quite literally cannot keep up with the demand for their Sriracha. This is particularly notable because the company has never spent a single cent on advertising, nor, according to Tran, do they even have a sales department, having used the same 10 distributors for decades. As Tran himself so eloquently puts it, "I don't advertise because I can't advertise." That's not to say they only produce Sriracha in small quantities. With an initial contract of using 50 acres of the Underwood family farms to grow chili peppers, today that number has swelled to a whopping 1,700 acres, which is about 2.7 square miles or 7 square kilometers. This results in over 100 million pounds, about 45 million kilograms of chilies harvested over a 10-week period in which they make their entire year's supply of Sriracha. The result of all this is an estimated $100 million per year in revenue for Huy Fong Foods, a number that, according to Tran, has been growing by approximately 20% per year for many years now as they manage to slowly increase production in an attempt to meet the demand for their sauces. Despite not trademarking the name of his flagship product, never advertising, nor employing a sales department, and never once raising the wholesale price of Sriracha, Tran also bucks the normal trend in business when demand outstrips supply, as it has pretty much since the beginning of the company. Instead of raising prices, he insists his distributors never charge more than $7.99 for a bottle of his sauce, even in the largest sizes. This is to keep in line with the Huy Fong Foods motto of a rich man's sauce at the poor man's price. On top of this, Tran is famous for turning down very lucrative business deals in connection with his sauces, as well as several attempts by major food manufacturers to outright buy the company. When once asked why he was seemingly so against maximizing profits on his product, a frustrated Tran reiterated that his only goal is to sell hot sauce to those who want it, and that businesses that approach him are never interested in the product, only in the profits. Thus, given they don't really care about the product itself in his estimation, he has no interest in making business deals with them, regardless of how much money it might make him. Again, as he so poignantly noted, his simple dream was never to become a billionaire, but rather to make enough fresh chili sauce so that everyone who wants Huy Fong can have it, nothing more. Alright, now let's get into those bonus facts. Notoriously secretive, Tran seldom gives interviews and has long maintained, as previously mentioned, that his only goal is to sell his hot sauce to whoever wants it. A bottle of Sriracha in everyone's hands is my only goal. And now for another bonus fact. Partially as a result, directly after they moved the production of Sriracha to the aforementioned massive location in Irwindale in 2013, production of the sauce was halted by a lawsuit filed by the city, claiming the grinding of chilies released odors and eye-watering airborne irritants. The suit went on to claim that the factory was causing residents nearby to have nosebleeds, headaches, and a myriad of respiratory problems. This led Tran and executives at Huy Fong Foods to decide to finally open their factory to the public. Lam noted, "We started the tours initially because we wished to have the visitors judge for themselves whether we were a public nuisance or not." Tran himself addressed the concerns of the public about the potential irritants that could be released by the Sriracha making process by buying a large banner to hang on the door to the factory that read, "No tear gas being made here." And now for another bonus fact. Thanks to opening up its doors to the general public and those involved in the lawsuit, and no doubt partially thanks to the fact that many other cities across the country publicly offered to take in the massive company, the lawsuit was finally dropped in May of 2014, allowing for production of Sriracha to resume. And now for another bonus fact. Despite Tran's evident reluctance to maximize the revenue potential of Sriracha and near total refusal to engage with the public unless it's absolutely necessary, he, rather adorably, reportedly sets aside time each day to read emails from fans of the brand and scan social media for mentions of his sauce. The 72-year-old Tran reportedly especially enjoys reading about unique ways customers are using his product. In the world of food advertising, there's a concept known as propping, which is just industry jargon for making the food look as good as possible via sometimes rather, shall we say, unusual means. While proper lighting and setting are a given, a great food stylist, which is a thing by the way, will do much more than that. For example, it's common practice when shooting meat to lightly spray it with oil to give the illusion that it's plump, juicy, and fresh from the oven, when in reality it may be several days old and already beginning to rot when an advertising picture is taken of it. For example, consider this quote from professional food stylist Emma Feigenbaum about a Thanksgiving shoot that she did. "I was doing a Thanksgiving dinner shoot for a clothing advertisement, and we made 3 turkeys at the beginning of the 4-day shoot. We had to leave them outside, and every day that they didn't use them, we had to juice them back up and make the turkeys look like new. When they finally put the turkeys on the table, they smelled so bad that everyone was gagging." Propping is an open secret in the advertising industry, and the food stylists responsible for the glamour shots you see of everything from Big Macs to bottles of beer are in high demand. Now, your first instinct might be to say that this all sounds, well, mighty deceptive, and in fact, well, it can be, which is part of why professional food stylists can command such a premium for their services. Paying someone who knows how close to the knuckle they can get without technically breaking any rules and getting the company they contracted with in trouble, even when costing obscene prices for the work actually done, is a hell of a lot cheaper than facing a massive lawsuit or the FTC coming down hard on your company, as we are going to get into shortly. For now, if you're wondering, the American Association of Advertising Agencies notes that a typical 30-second commercial shoot for a restaurant costs on average around $500,000. Using this same price per 30 seconds for a 2-hour movie, that's a budget of about $120 million, which, while cheap for certain types of huge blockbuster movies with massive amounts of special effects, is pretty expensive on the whole, especially when you consider the crew doing a restaurant commercial does not need extensive, elaborate sets, travel budgets, massive crews and support staff, food budgets spanning months, advanced special effects, and, well, the list goes on to a ridiculous degree. As for the top food stylist crews in the business, they tend to earn much more than that for the same shoot, and in all cases, pro food stylists pay attention to a lot of tiny details pretty much everyone who watches the commercial will completely miss. For example, Gay Benson notes for Doritos commercials, they would go through numerous bags to collect the perfect set of chips to shoot. When filming for McDonald's, they literally count the sesame seeds on various buns to find one with whatever amount and distribution was considered optimal for the shots that they were taking. So going back to the rules and the pro food stylists that are so good at stopping just short of the line that would get the company that hired them in trouble, according to an expert in advertising law called Stuart Friedel, when it comes to advertising food, there are, to quote, "a million nuances, but essentially 2 rules. The most pertinent to today's topic being that you cannot misrepresent the product." What constitutes misrepresentation, of course, is a matter of some debate and more a shades of grey type of thing rather than just black and white. For the curious, the second rule is that you cannot simulate the product in use without indicating that it is a simulation, which, according to Friedel, is why when you watch ads about TVs and the like, there's almost always a disclaimer saying that the image on screen is a simulation. In specific regards to food, stylists and prop masters dressing food for ads have to be exceptionally careful to not do anything to the food that could be construed as a deliberate attempt to misrepresent it. Even still, there is a lot a particularly savvy photographer can do to make the food look good without crossing the line. For example, let's say you're taking a picture of a burrito and the tortilla keeps flopping around. Replacing the burrito with a bit of stiff fabric is illegal, and apparently taking the time to perfectly wrap a burrito so that it doesn't flop is just too much effort for a small crew only getting paid $500,000 to do a few day shoot and some pre- and post-production work. However, gluing the tortilla shut isn't illegal at all, and it's workarounds like this that are why food stylists get paid the big bucks. Of course, as bad as spraying 4-day-old meat with oil and gluing burritos together might sound, back in the 1960s, the world of food advertising was basically the Wild West. Tricks like using motor oil in lieu of syrup were commonplace and completely legal. In fact, in many cases, stuff like this was preferable to using the real thing because it lasted longer and was easier to shoot. Another trick is to use mashed potatoes covered in resin or Crisco as a stand-in for ice cream. After all, ice cream melts pretty quick, particularly when subjected to being close loosely lit, and photo shoots sometimes last a long time. Using the real product simply was much harder than faking it, especially when you need a consistent look from shot to shot. Speaking of shoots lasting a long time, if you want to make a drink look cold, according to the aforementioned Feigenbaum, when I'm making cocktails or other drinks for a shoot, I spray on this glycerin mix and it suddenly looks cold. Plus, it doesn't go away and won't leave fingerprints. Or if you'd like some gooey melted chocolate, using actually melted chocolate is going to be a pain to shoot and keep consistent. Instead, as Steve Gerald notes, we sometimes use fake chocolate, this borax gel that's the same stuff they use to make slime. You add brown food coloring to it and cocoa powder and it looks like chocolate, except you don't have to worry about it cooling down or melting. It just stays the perfect consistency. Alright, so what does Campbell Soup have to do with all of this stuff? Well, in 1968, a New York-based advertising company called BBDO were contracted by the company to create an ad for their new chicken and stars soup. While shooting the ad, BBDO art director Robson Ballantyne noted that the vegetables in the soup kept sinking to the bottom of the bowl, which he felt was ruining the shot. After trying and failing to pour the soup in a way that would correct this, Ballantyne simply put clear glass marbles in the bottom of the bowl. The idea being, in this case, that the chunks of vegetable would sit on top of the marbles and remain visible. Initially, nobody was all that bothered by this because, as noted, it was standard practice in the industry at the time to do stuff like this. But it's not like this was even close to the worst thing advertisers were doing at the time. So, why did this spur a massive shift in law concerning advertising? Well, there's an old saying in the advertising industry that the only person who pays as much attention to your ads as you do is your competition. This is something the Campbell Soup Company learned firsthand when H.J. Heinz Company, known for their many sauces but also a maker of soups, filed a complaint with the FTC about Campbell's putting marbles in their soup to make it look like it contained more ingredients than it did. Now, Heinz themselves, of course, allegedly did similar things in shooting their own various products, but this was hardly the point. Mostly this just seemed a way to jab at their rival. Heinz reportedly also sent the FTC a bunch of corroborating evidence against Campbell's soup during the subsequent probe. Campbell Soup were understandably rather annoyed about this, and a few years later returned the favor by kindly alerting the FTC to the fact that Heinz's ketchup contained mold, apparently. In 1979, Heinz jabbed back using the age-old practice of, if you can't beat 'em, sue 'em, suing Campbell's for having a monopoly on canned soup. At the time, Campbell's had an 85% market share on canned soup. In any event, going back to the whole marbles thing, during a meeting with the United States Federal Trade Commission, the head of BBDO's art department ultimately explained to them that we want to make the food look as good as it actually is. For example, we put marbles in the soup to force the vegetables to the top of the bowl. This was a statement that prompted a stunned FTC official to ask incredulously, "Marbles in the soup?" Needless to say, this wasn't going well already. Nevertheless, it is worth noting that throughout the case, Campbell Soup and BBDO maintained that they'd done nothing wrong. This was a sentiment echoed by many others in the industry who didn't work for Heinz. As E.E. Norris noted wryly, "The only law we thought we were breaking was the law of gravity. It all seemed perfectly legitimate to us." Vincent Meehan, who was also involved in this particular marbles debacle, further went on, "What we did with the marbles was purely and simply to prop the ingredients. We did not add ingredients to make the soup have more ingredients than it was supposed to have." Of course, one might argue that it did seem to imply there were more ingredients, so much so that they brimmed to the top, a position that seemingly the FTC agreed with. Nevertheless, Campbell's Soup fought the case valiantly in court, pointing out a reasonably good counter-argument that the act of putting marbles in their soup was technically less deceptive than not, since not doing so made the soup look like it contained only liquid. But this didn't work, and FTC charged BBDO and Campbell's Soup with deceptive advertising. The matter might have dropped from there if not for the general public's subsequent outrage when they found out about it a year later. Most influential among those unhappy with their soup looking decidedly more liquid in real life was an organization known as the Students Opposed to Unfair Practices, or SOUP for formed in 1970 by a group of law students at George Washington University. They argued that simply pulling deceptive ads as the FTC had ordered wasn't enough. After all, the advertisement had already worked its magic to some extent. They felt that Campbell should have to run new ads explicitly explaining their deception and showing what the real product looked like. While the FTC dismissed the group initially, within a year, FTC officials adopted their own version of the idea that Soup was advocating for, namely something that came to be known as corrective advertising. Essentially, in especially egregious cases of deceptive advertising in the future, the FTC now had the power to order any company who they felt had crossed the line to issue new ads explaining their deception. Other penalties that might be levied included simply a ban on advertising a certain product at all for some set amount of time, or both of these at the same time. Even though the FTC never ordered them to make such a correction, the threat of them doing so made the company drop that specific practice like, to quote one source on the matter, a red-hot spoon. By 1972, the FTC in turn had dropped the case against Campbell's. The damage, it was done though, and advertisers quickly stopped many of the existing deceptive practices that were being used to advertise food in the hopes of avoiding earning the ire of both the FTC and the public. In the long run, however, this mostly just forced food stylists to make the food in ads look especially delicious to get ever more creative in how to do their jobs. For example, if you're wondering to get around rules about putting marbles in the bottom of bowls of soup to make the solid ingredients more visible, food stylists today typically put soup in comically shallow bowls and frame the photos in ways that hides this fact from the viewers. On top of that, another common trick is to simply scoop the soup into a shallow ladle or spoon and overlay it above the bowl to hide most of the bowl's contents, thus making the non-liquid contents of the soup extremely prominent to the viewer. And now for a bonus fact. Ever wondered what the 57 in 57 varieties of Heinz means? Well, want to know more? By 1892, H.J. Heinz Company had grown from a small company selling horseradish in clear glass jars, something Henry Heinz started doing at the age of around 10 years old when his parents gave him 3/4 of an acre of land to start a business with, to having a decent-sized company selling over 60 products. It was at this time that the business instituted their now famous 57 varieties of Heinz slogan. Heinz had come up with the slogan while riding on a train in New York City in 1892. While on the train, he spotted a shoe store advertisement that was promoting their 21 styles of shoes. He thought his company should have a similar slogan promoting the fact that they produced many different products. Rather than go with the exact number of products they made at the time, which would continue to grow to nearly 6,000 a day, he instead chose 57. According to H.J. Heinz Company, he chose this number simply because he thought it was a lucky number and he liked the sound of 57 varieties of Heinz. It was also reasonably close to the number of products that they actually produced at the time, so they just went with it. Few junk food items have ever reached the heights of general and almost universal popularity as the humble potato chip and its tasty derivative brethren, the tortilla chip. But who invented the potato chip and its cheesy and blessed of the light modification, nachos? How about the invention of tasty Doritos? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that's what we're going to discuss today, as well as along the way what those little black spots you find in tortilla chips are, what's up with the green potato chips and are they really poisonous, who invented the thicker fried potato variety of goodness that we call the French fry, and why Pringles are sort of the red-headed stepchild of the potato chip world, not really worthy to be even called such. So put on your nacho sombrero, lather yourself in cheese dip and guacamole, and let's dive in, shall we? First, who invented the noble and in all ways exquisitely glorious potato chip? The prevailing story of the origin of the chip of potato starts in Saratoga Springs, New York, a historically affluent resort community. The year was 1853, 8 years before the beginning of the American Civil War. Known for its mineral springs and their supposed rejuvenation properties, Saratoga Springs had just started becoming a tourist destination with the help of the railroad that cut through the town. Resorts, inns, restaurants, and spas had begun to crop up along the shores of Saratoga Lake. Moon's Lake House, owned by Carrie Moon, was one of the finest of those establishments. Vacationers and wealthy summer homeowners visited the restaurant often. At the restaurant, two people shared the cooking responsibilities: Catherine, Aunt Kate Weeks, or brother-in-law, depending on who's telling the story, George Crumb.
George was born George Speck. His mother was Native American and his father was a free African American making a living as a horse jockey. When George was a young man, he adopted his father's horse racing name, Crumb. After an earlier career as a trapper and hunting guide, he made his way to Saratoga Springs, where he began cooking and by all accounts seemed pretty good at it. So good, in fact, that he was hired by Carrie Moon to work at his restaurant. Up to this point, based on the evidence at hand, we can be fairly certain that all of this is in the ballpark of true. But here's where perhaps elements of legend creep in. The story goes that it was about dinner time during Moon's second summer season on the lake that a customer came in and ordered Moon's fried potatoes, the well-known house specialty. Crumb whipped up a batch and served it to the customer, who complained that potatoes were cut much too thick, so he sent the item to be remade. Crumb did his best to make them thinner, yet when the discerning patron got his second order, he again complained that the thickness of the potatoes wasn't to his liking, so once again the customer told Crumb to try again. Crumb, none too pleased that someone would insult his cooking, cut the potatoes paper thin, dumped them in a vat of oil, let them cook so long that they became hard and crispy, and then salted them heavily, thinking that these fried potatoes would now be inedible. When he served the item, the customer took a bite, and then another, before proclaiming that the fried slices of potatoes were delicious. It became known as the Saratoga chip, and the potato chip was born. Or so the legend goes. As one might imagine, there are several versions of this story, and all are disputed, and as we'll get into, for good reason. First off, assuming the story is true, there is the question of who this customer actually was. The less interesting account was that it was simply a regular, albeit whiny farmer, hungry from a long day out in the fields. The more famed tale is that the customer was shipping and railroad mogul Cornelius Vanderbilt. This part of the story was, at the very least, appropriated by the Snack Food Association in the late 1970s. The Snack Food Association, in partnership with Mary Lou Whitney, the wife of the great-great-grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, published an account, essentially an advertisement, that mostly leaves Crumb out of the origin story, partially crediting Vanderbilt with the invention. Says the ad, "The chef, despite Vanderbilt, sliced his potatoes very thin, fried them to a crisp and salted them heavily. Vanderbilt loved them, and the potato chip was born." It was this advertising campaign that firmly established in popular folklore how the potato chip was invented and who invented it. Later, Saratoga Springs historian Violet Dunn would later write a letter to the Snack Food Association claiming, "I am annoyed at Mary Lou Whitney when she claims Commodore Vanderbilt was the man who refused to accept the fried potatoes. There is no documentation to substantiate this. It could have been your great-grandfather or mine." You might not at all be surprised to learn that George Crumb himself also had nothing to do with the potato chip, at least in terms of its origin. As an article in Western Folklore Journal written by William Fox and May Banner in 1983 points out, it took 70 years from when the chip was supposedly invented for Crumb to be credited with the invention. In fact, when he passed away in 1913, the local newspaper's obituary of Crumb didn't even have a single mention of potato chip in it. He was first mentioned in relation to the potato chip in the 1920s when a local historian wrote, "Crumb is said to have been the actual inventor of Saratoga chips when he was employed at Moon's Old Place." Another version of the tale involves Crumb and his sister or sister-in-law, Aunt Kate Weeks. In a 1940 article from the Saratogan, written by the town's historian at the time, Jean McGregor, it claims that Weeks was actually the one to accidentally create the potato chip. In this story, Weeks was making pastries, frying them in a vat of fat. She was also peeling potatoes in an attempt to multitask. Well, the slice of potato fell into the fat, and when she fished it out, Crumb saw the greasy potato sitting on the counter and took a bite. It was so good that Crumb said they needed to sell them, which they did, for 10 cents a bag. So, what's the truth in any of this? It's always possible Crumb may have served potato chips at some point, whether at Moon's Lake House or later at his own restaurant, which he opened in 1860. It was a popular item in the area later in his life. It's also been claimed he commonly served baskets of chips on tables as an appetizer for guests. And he may have even invented his own version of it, even possibly being ignorant of any other. But this all seems unlikely, as if he had invented it, one would think that he would have claimed this fact at some point to help promote his restaurant, given the eventual popularity of Saratoga chips. Further, the New York Tribune in 1891 did a write-up on Crumb's restaurant, Crumb's House, and made no mention of anything remotely resembling potato chips being served there, which also calls into question the claims that he served the chips as an appetizer to all guests. Perhaps most damning of all is that Crumb commissioned a biography of his life to be written in 1893. In it, there is not one mention of him inventing potato chips. But whatever the case, no one from Saratoga Springs can really claim that they were the first to make potato chips, though the chefs in the town did help popularize it. Saratoga chips was even a relatively common name for potato chips up until around the mid-20th century. But it seems the potato chip was invented earlier in the 19th century in Europe and possibly before. After all, potatoes were a very common food, often fried throughout the UK, France, and Belgium particularly. On this note, potatoes were first introduced to Europe through the Spanish. In 1537, Jimenez de Quesada and his Spanish forces encountered a village in Colombia where all the natives had fled. Among other things, they found in the native foodstuffs potatoes, which the Spanish initially called truffles. Around 20 years later, potatoes were brought back to Spain and also introduced to Italy. At this time, the potatoes were still quite small and bitter, and they didn't grow well in either Spain or Italy. However, over time, larger and less bitter versions of the plant were cultivated, and the plant eventually caught on elsewhere in Europe, though it was initially met with quite a bit of resistance due to the fact that the Europeans were convinced potatoes caused a variety of diseases and were also even thought to be poisonous by some, though seemingly not everyone, particularly it would seem in places like Belgium. It should be noted here that they had good reason to assume them poisonous, which we'll get into later when talking about those green potato chips. In any event, later the French got into the game, which helped more widely popularize the potato, and all of this thanks to a French army medical officer named Antoine Augustin Parmentier, who very famously championed the potato throughout France and parts of Europe. During the 7 Years' War, Parmentier was taken captive, and as part of his prison rations, he was given potatoes. At this time, the French had previously used potatoes only for hog feed and seemingly never ate them themselves, as noted, due to concern over diseases. In fact, in 1748, the French Parliament even banned cultivation of potatoes, as they were convinced potatoes caused leprosy. However, while in prison in Prussia, Parmentier was forced to cultivate and eat potatoes and found the French notions about the potato just weren't true. When he came back to France, Parmentier began championing the potato as a potential food source. Finally, in 1772, the Paris Faculty of Medicine proclaimed that potatoes were edible for humans, though Parmentier still encountered significant resistance and wasn't even allowed to grow potatoes in his garden at the Invalids Hospital, where he worked as a pharmacist. Parmentier then began a more aggressive campaign to promote the potato in France, hosting dinners featuring potatoes with such notable dignitaries as Benjamin Franklin, Antoine Lavoisier, King Louis XVI, and Queen Marie Antoinette, who incidentally has gotten a bad rap from history, mostly just because the victors write the popular history. So you can see our video on that subject and her tragic life and death. In any event, Parmentier also would hire armed guards to surround his potato patch to try to convince people that what was in the patch was very valuable. He would then tell the guards to accept any bribes they were offered by people and let them steal the potatoes. In the end, though, it took a famine in 1785 for the potato to become popular in France. Once the French accepted the potato, its popularity skyrocketed in the country. By 1795, potatoes were being grown on a very large scale in France, including at the Royal Gardens at Tuileries, where the gardens were converted into potato fields. As a brief aside, within that span of time, the French either invented or learned to make so-called French fries. Once discovered or invented in France, French fries became extremely popular in the country, particularly in Paris, where they were sold by pushcart vendors on the streets and called frites. Now, it should be noted that all of this happened in the late 18th century, which was as much as 100 years after some claim the Belgians were supposedly already making French fries. But by other arguments, this all happened around the same time for both the French and the Belgians, and it isn't really totally clear from hard evidence what the truth is here. Historical accounts indicate that the Belgians were possibly frying up thin strips of potato as early as the 17th century. Though, again, better documented evidence wasn't until the late 18th century in the Meuse Valley between Dinant and Liège in Belgium. How it is speculated they came up with the idea was that in this area it was very common for the people to fry up small fish as a staple for their meals. However, when the rivers froze up thick enough, it tended to make it somewhat difficult to get fish. So instead of frying up fish in these times, they would cut up potatoes in long thin slices and fry them up as they did the fish. Giving some credence to this story is that the Spanish controlled much of what is now modern-day Belgium at the time the Spanish introduced the potato to Europe. So at least the Belgians probably were among the first to have a crack at the potato in terms of thinking up ways to prepare food from potatoes. Going back to French fries and who actually invented them, it should be noted that shortly before the potato became popular in France, the Franco-Austrian War was going on, also known as the War of Austrian Succession, much of which took place around modern-day Belgium. So, it's possible that the French soldiers were introduced to fries by the Belgians at this point, and a couple of decades later, when the potato became popular in France, these former soldiers then introduced the preparation method to the rest of the country. Or it's possible the French came up with the idea on their own and spread them to Belgium around the same time, or that both came up with the idea independently. It's, after all, not exactly being rocket surgery to think to dice up in various ways and fry the potatoes. Whatever the case, it was the French who seemed to be the ones that spread fries to America and Britain. Noteworthy here, in 1802, Thomas Jefferson had the White House chef, Frenchman Honore Julien, prepare potatoes served in the French manner for a dinner party. He described these as potatoes deep fried while raw in small cuttings, French fries, at a White House state dinner. Classy. This is one of the earliest references to fried potato strips being referred to as French. Going back to the worldwide spread of popularity of the so-called French fry, it was, in turn, the Americans, through fast food chains, that eventually popularly introduced them to the rest of the non-European world under the name French fries. Ironically, because of this latter spread by American fast food chains, in many parts of the non-European world, French fries are sometimes called American fries. Whatever the case on any of this, going back to the much thinner fried potato, the glorious chip, it seems likely, and all evidence points to, that it was invented in Europe and seemingly just a natural extension of the French fry, more or less prepared in a similar way, but much thinner sliced. Whoever was the first to actually do it in Europe, thoroughly debunking the aforementioned popular crumb origin story, we have Englishman William Kitchener's famed 1822 cookbook, Cook's Oracle, which has a recipe for potato fried in slices or shavings. The recipe is extremely close to the original Saratoga chip, having the chef cut the potatoes in shavings, round and round, dry them well in a clean cloth, and fry them in lard or dripping. Send them up with a very little salt sprinkled over them. This cookbook was a bestseller in the UK and in America and was published 6 years before George Crumb was even born. Beyond that, there are several other cookbooks that featured essentially the same thing before Crumb supposedly invented them. For instance, the Virginia Housewife by Mary Randolph, 1824, and Alexis Sawyer's Shilling Cookery for the People, 1845, among many others. Despite all the varied versions and lack of documented evidence, the Saratoga chip is still very much part of the town's identity today. Just the potato chip wasn't invented there, as is so commonly stated. Whatever the case, potato chips saw a huge burst of popularity outside of being served in restaurants thanks to former nurse and lawyer Laura Scudder. Incidentally, Scudder was also the first known female attorney in Ukiah, California. Scudder eventually moved to Monterey Park, California, and started a business in 1926 selling various food items, including potato chips. As you might expect from the date and from the fact that she was a woman in an era when women weren't generally welcomed as business owners, her business struggled a bit at first due to the Great Depression and that many companies refused to work with her. Even getting insurance for her business's trucks was a bit of an issue until she managed to find a female insurance agent. At this point, shelf life for the chips was generally poor due to a lack of effective packaging. They were usually sold in bulk in cracker barrels or tins, neither of which was ideal. Beyond the poor shelf life, crisps at the bottom also tended to become crushed. Scudder got the bright idea to have her employees iron wax paper into bags, which they could then put the chips inside and seal shut. This method worked amazingly well and helped make the former popular restaurant item something consumers could buy and store relatively effectively at home. Another innovation of Scudder's was to put the date the item was packaged on the chip bag so consumers could make sure that they were getting fresh bags. On that note, today chips are typically stored in bags filled with nitrogen, which simultaneously helps keep the chips from getting crushed during shipping and keeps them fresher even longer. In any event, needless to say, she soon had a whole fleet of trucks that needed to be insured, and of course she stuck with the lone insurance agent in her area willing to work with a female business owner at the time. She would later sell her business for $5 million, about $48 million today, though she noteworthy turned down a $9 million offer because the buyers wouldn't guarantee her employees jobs after the sale. At its peak, her business would go on to gross well over $100 million in sales annually. Moving on from the gloriousness of the Hubble potato chip and its many flavors, let us now discuss the pinnacle of all chip-based cuisine, the wonder that is nachos, and what saintly individual deserves to be honored for all time for bequeathing it to us. While of course many choose the tortilla-based chip variety for nachos, regardless of chip type, the legend of nachos has an American football-centric history that doesn't date all that far back, similar to another Super Bowl party staple, buffalo wings, that only became popular a little under 3 decades ago. Prior to the 1940s, the word nacho had two meanings. One was a Tex-Mex slang word combining naturally and, of course, into nacho. The other was a common nickname for a small boy whose name was Ignacio, basically the Mexican equivalent of calling a boy named William Billy or Timothy Timmy. Discovery of this latter fact led Adriana Orr from the Oxford English Dictionary in a search to see if there was an Ignacio behind nachos. What she ultimately found was a man named Ignacio Anaya Sr., who, while he probably wasn't the first person to ever decide to mix tortilla chips with melted cheese and jalapenos, does seem to be the person directly responsible for nachos becoming a thing, along with lending his name to the food item. The nacho story begins in the early 1940s in the town of Piedras Negras in Mexico, which is only miles from the American border and near Eagle Pass, Texas. That was the site of historic Fort Duncan, which during World War II was used as a support facility for the nearby Eagle Pass Army Airfield. With the border only a few miles away, many who were stationed in the region often traveled into Mexico for a better bite to eat. This is where details of this legend get deliciously murky. To wit, in Piedras Negras, a favourite restaurant of the border-crossing Americans was the patriotically named Victory Club, then owned by one Rudolfo de los Santos. Another such restaurant in the town was the Old Moderno restaurant. Both establishments featured a common worker, the aforementioned Ignacio Anaya Sr., who was more affectionately known as Nacho Anaya. Stories are mixed, including ones featuring interviews with Anaya Sr. himself, as to which he was working at when he first whipped up the appetizer that would come to bear his name. Wherever he was when he first made it, after their advent, he made sure they were served at both restaurants. While there are various tellings of the tale, according to an article by Clarence J. LaRoche published on May 23, 1954 in the San Antonio Express titled Nachos Natch, the first known account of the origins of nachos, Ignacio himself told LaRoche that one night a group of customers, often variously claimed to have been soldiers or soldiers' wives, tired of the normal fare, came in asking for something completely new. LaRoche then stated Ignacio told him, "Honestly, I didn't have the least idea what I was going to try, but I went into the kitchen, looked around, and started groping for an idea. I saw a bowl of freshly fried pieces of tortilla. Then I figured some grated cheese on them might be alright. Well, I got the cheese and began sprinkling the tortilla pieces with it. About this time, I got the idea to put some jalapeno strips atop the cheese. I got the jalapenos, and as I finished putting the strips on the cheese, I decided it would be a good idea to put the whole thing into the oven to melt the cheese." In a 1969 interview appearing in the San Antonio Express and News, he would further state that his recipe for nachos was mostly just a variation on quesadillas that his foster mother used to make him as a child, so it wasn't really that much of a leap. When the customers asked what the dish was called, he told them Nachos Especiales. Within days, patrons were clamoring for Nachos Special, and Anaya was teaching other workers at the pair of restaurants that he worked at how to make them. He also soon began experimenting with variations on the original, such as including refried beans and guacamole. It should also be noted that the original date of these first nachos is disputed. It was claimed both in the aforementioned 1954 San Antonio Express interview as well as in a Corpus Christi Times interview in 1974 that Ignacio said he first whipped them up in 1940. But in both cases, this wasn't a direct quote from him, just these articles claiming that he said that. If this is true, it would call into question the commonly stated soldier or soldiers' wives angle, as Fort Duncan wasn't made into a military base in World War II until 1942, and Eagle Pass Army Airfield wasn't activated until that same year. However, most sources, including Ignacio Jr., state the correct year was actually 1943. Whatever the case, in the 1940s, the appetizer began to spread along the Texas-Mexico border towns under the name Nachos Especiales, with one of the first known documented instances of this occurring in 1949 in A Taste of Texas by Jane Trahi. Quote, "There's a little restaurant in the small Mexican town of Villa Acuna that serves some of the finest food in the world. For part of World War II, Mr. Julian Cross, managing editor of the San Antonio Express, was stationed on the Rio Grande border. One night, a small group of officers, one terribly homesick, decided to visit Pedro, their favorite waiter there. Like all Latins, Pedro just couldn't stand unhappiness. He did everything but stand on his head to cheer his morose, uniformed guest. When nothing, including the martinis, worked, Pedro left. Sometime later, he returned carrying a large dish of Nachos Especiales. 'These nachos,' said Pedro, 'will help El Capitan. Soon he will forget his troubles, for nachos make one romantic.'" It goes on to give the recipe as 1 package of Mexican tortillas, a small hunk of American cheese, a bottle or can of pickled peppers, preferably jalapenos, cut tortillas into small triangles triangular pieces, place in a pan and put to a medium hot oven to toast. Remove from the oven when barely crisp. Put a small piece of cheese on each piece of tortilla. Replace in the oven until the cheese is melted. Remove from oven and garnish each piece with a small slice of pickled pepper and serve. A year before this, nachos appeared in the San Antonio Light in an advertisement for the Latin Quarter Mexican restaurant. Nachos, Mexican hors d'oeuvres, 35 cents. Here is a real dainty golden fried tortilla strips, deliciously spiced, topped with mellow melted cheese and garnished with chili jalapeno bits. As for Anaya Sr. himself, he would go on to open his own restaurant, Nachos Restaurant, in Piedras Negras, where nachos especiales were featured on the menu. By 1959, Nachos would make the jump to the West Coast thanks to a young woman named Carmen Rocha, who moved from San Antonio to LA with her husband. Since San Antonio is less than a 3-hour drive from Piedras Negras, she had grown up with nachos. When Rocha got a job serving at El Cholo Mexican restaurant on Los Angeles' Western Avenue, she told the chefs about the easy and quick-to-make tasty snack that she used to eat as a teen called nachos. Decades later, El Cholo had become an LA institution thanks in large part to Rocha and her nachos. When she died in 2008, even El Cholo regular Jack Nicholson grieved, and he told the LA Times, "Carmen was wonderful to me and to everybody. It's a community loss." While Rocha's introduction of nachos to the West Coast surely contributed to its popularization, there's no bigger influence on how nachos are consumed today than Frank Liberto, the father of nachos. He's the man who introduced so-called fast food or stadium nachos, the ones with the gooey yellow cheese, to sports stadiums and movie theaters. With his family originally hailing from Sicily, Liberto took over the San Antonio-based family food business from his father, Rico Liberto, selling concessions. In fact, the company was perhaps the first American concession-focused business, even pioneering the selling of peanuts at the circus. As for the tale of the evolution and popularization of nachos at a Texas Rangers baseball game in Arlington in 1976, Liberto's company, Rico's, sold the very first stadium nachos featuring a jalapeno cheese sauce Liberto had come up with. The advantage here over melting grated cheese on the chips was that the gooey cheese sauce could be ladled up quickly and had a long shelf life. Despite the sauce not actually being cheese, this according to the FDA, it was an immediate hit and outsold every other food item at the stadium in 1976. Even better for concessions business was that nacho sales also resulted in a large spike in beverage purchases, as you might expect from people consuming a sauce with jalapeno juice in it. Just as importantly, the introduction of nachos didn't seem to negatively impact things like hot dog and popcorn sales. This later potential issue was a big concern Liberto frequently heard when first pitching his nachos to various event groups. Within a year of this, with an eye on moving more into the lucrative movie theater concessions industry, Liberto purchased Associated Popcorn, which was a major supplier to various theaters in Texas. This, combined with John Rowley of United Artists Theaters discovering Liberto's nachos, saw gooey cheese nachos hit the concession stands in theaters across the state. As foul nachos became more mainstream nationwide, this is thanks to their being served at the Dallas Cowboys Stadium in 1978. At the time, the Cowboys were known as America's team and often played host to ABC's Monday Night Football. The announcing team for those games included the legendary Howard Cosell. The story goes, at least according to Liberto's son, that while trying to fill dead air during a blowout, Cosell groped around for things to talk about and remarked on how delicious his snack was, these new nachos. Whether that was really his original motivation or not, Cosell did indeed begin to describe plays on air as a nacho, as in that was a nacho run, and extolled the virtues of the tasty snack frequently. Not long after this, stadium nachos were in every stadium across the country, thanks to Cosell's near constant promotion of the word and food nacho. Unfortunately, Nacho Anaya Sr. died in 1975, so was never able to see a version of his culinary invention being talked about in front of a nationally televised audience, nor see it become a nationwide hit. Today, there's reportedly a bronze plaque up in Piedras Negras that honors the creator of this Mexican hors d'oeuvre. Additionally, October the 21st is considered International Day of the Nacho. No matter the day or place, however, according to Anaya's granddaughter in an interview with the San Antonio Express News in 2002, nachos today just don't taste as good as the original. She states, "The chips are different. They're not homemade chips like he used to do. Or maybe it's the hands of the chef." Bonus fact. Speaking of tortilla chips, let's talk about the flavored variety, and in particular, the pinnacle of tortilla chip goodness, the Dorito. On this one, a blessed of the light man named Archibald Clark West was born to Scottish immigrants in Indiana in 1941. With his mother too poor to take care of him, he was raised in a Masonic home after his father passed away. In a true American dream story, West was able to take a step above his impoverished roots when he was offered a scholarship to Franklin College. He graduated in 1936 with a degree in business and went on to serve in the Navy during World War II. When he returned from the war, he put his degree to use by working as a traveling sales representative and then working in advertising campaigns in New York for Jello. By 1960, he found himself working for Fritos in Dallas, Texas. That's when his fortunes really took off. The idea for Doritos was conceived in Disneyland, of all places. It wasn't West who actually first made them either. The original Doritos were made in Casa de Fritos, a restaurant owned by the Fritos founder, Elmer Doolin. The restaurant was located in Frontierland and served standard Tex-Mex, with every meal boasting a complimentary bag of Fritos. The restaurant was a hit, but it didn't make its own tortillas, a job which was contracted out to Alex Foods. It was a salesman from Alex Foods who saw discarded tortillas at Casa de Fritos and told the cook he should fry them up and make tortilla chips out of them rather than just throw them out. Because tortilla chips weren't yet made by Fritos and Fritos themselves were given out with the meals, Casa de Fritos hadn't thought to offer them like other Mexican restaurants did. The cook did as he advised and used his own special blend of seasoning, and well, the chips were a hit. The restaurant put them on the menu as a regular item, but didn't inform the Frito company of the change. About a year later, in 1961, West walked by the restaurant on a family vacation and noticed the chips. He was then the vice president of marketing for the company and felt like he had stumbled upon a goldmine. When he returned to work, he pitched the idea of selling packaged tortilla chips, a happy medium between Lay's thin cut potato chips and Fritos' thick curly corn chips. His bosses weren't initially convinced. Not to be deterred, he managed to finagle some funding from other projects the company was working on, which allowed him to make and test out the product, first making taco-flavored and plain corn-flavored, the latter of which remained tied for his favorite throughout his life, owing to being good for dipping. His other favorite was Cool Ranch, which, obviously. After selling them locally and seeing the chips become hugely popular, the other execs were finally convinced and decided to move forward with selling them nationally by 1966. West retired from his position as vice president of marketing for Frito-Lay in 1971, but remained committed to Doritos and even continued testing out new flavors over the years. He died in 2011, just a year after his wife of 69 years passed away, in his case dying of complications of vascular surgery at the ripe old age of 97, having risen from a child of poor immigrants to the force behind one of the best-loved crunchy snacks in the world. At his funeral, his family tossed Dorito chips into his grave so that his favorite snack could always be with him. If you're wondering what flavor was used at his service, his daughter, Jana, stated it was just the plain. Otherwise, people would be like, "Thanks, Jana, I've got nacho all over my hand." Incidentally, while West was working at Fritos, he became friends with a Mr. David Pace of Pace's Salsa and Picante Sauces. Sales were slow for Pace at the time, and he turned to West, knowing he had some advertising experience, for advice. West made the simple suggestion of having the products placed beside chips, as they are commonly today, rather than in the ketchup aisle with other tomato-based items. Pace followed that advice, and sales figures immediately got insanely spicy compared to their mild numbers before. So moving swiftly on, now let's talk about the black specks on tortilla chips, and why some potato chips are green, and why those aren't wholly the best for you to eat. First, the specs. Now, I hope you're sitting down for this bit of information, but the staple ingredient for both corn and tortilla chips is corn. An ear of corn is made up of individual rows of kernels, and each kernel is attached to the cob via the tip cap located at the very bottom of the kernel. Strip away the tip cap and the hilum is revealed. The hilum is what seats the base of each kernel and draws in water and other ingredients that are needed during the growth process. The hilum, in a way, serves as a sort of umbilical cord for the kernel. Once the kernel's detached from the cob, the hilum remains as a type of scar from where it was connected. The hilum starts out clear and then progresses to light green and then brown and finally black, which shows up on some more mature kernels. It is these mature kernels that are used to make corn and tortilla chips. Since these specks of hilum do not disappear during the cooking process, they remain visible in the final food product. In addition to corn and tortilla chips, the black hilum can also typically be seen on taco shells, corn tortillas, and other similar foods made with corn. But to conclude, in some sense, when you are eating the black specks, you are eating the little ground up and murdered baby corn's umbilical cords. And onto the green potato chips then. As another bit of shocking information here, potatoes grow underground and thus are generally not going to get any direct sunlight to the potato part of the plant. However, sometimes some part of the potato does ultimately get exposed to sunlight, and as a result of this, chlorophyll develops. So why are the green potato chips sometimes called poisonous? After all, nothing is wrong with eating chlorophyll. Well, the answer lies in a glycoalkaloid that is also found in potato plants called solanine, which otherwise is produced in the above ground portions of the plant and provides some protection from insects and the like. For the potatoes themselves, lucky enough to get some sunlight and green of their own, this also ends up in the glorious potato chips created from these potatoes. Granted, the amount of solanine in that green potato chip is minimal, so much so that you have to eat a couple of dozen green potatoes in a day to suffer any ill effects from this. And for reference, a medium potato produces roughly 40 chips, so you'd need to eat several hundred green potato chips to suffer ill effects, which is unlikely. I mean, I think I can speak for all of us when I say that eating a few hundred potato chips in a day is totally not a thing of us, which is unlikely. But of course, they won't typically be green, and particularly less likely in modern times to encounter any green potato chip, as manufacturing processes have become more refined in relatively recent years to filter out such unwanted green potatoes and chips. All that said, you'll definitely not want to eat the leaves of the other above ground portions of the potato plant themselves, as their solanine levels are much higher. But of course, why eat the leaves when what's down below is so delicious? And finally today, let's talk about Pringles, shall we? One Dr. Frederick Barr was the one that originally came up with the saddle shape hyperbolic paraboloid of the fried dough that is Pringles. Note, not baked, as many seem to think. While employed by Procter & Gamble as a chemist, he was assigned the task of finding a way to get around the problem of stale and broken chips in bags, and thus worked on finding an alternative chip and container. That said, he was not the one to ultimately bring Pringles out as a commercial product. The chip he came up with just didn't taste very good, and he was eventually assigned a different task. Several years later, Alexander Leiper picked up where Bohr left off and managed to improve on the flavor of the fried dough. Thus, he is generally considered the inventor of Pringles, even though in reality he built off Bohr's work. The product that the two came up with, though, is not technically considered a potato chip. They were, however, originally called Pringles' newfangled potato chips. However, Pringles contain only about 42% potato-based content, with most of the rest being wheat starch and various types of flour, including from corn and rice. Thus, the US Food and Drug Administration made them change the name because their product didn't technically meet the definition of a potato chip. As such, they were only allowed to use the word chip in very restrictive ways. Specifically, if they wanted to continue to use chip, they were only allowed to say Pringles potato chips made from dried potatoes. Not being too fond of this requirement, the company changed the name slightly, using potato crisps rather than potato chips. Today, of course, most people just know them as Pringles. Jumping across the pond to merry old England, while Procter & Gamble initially argued that Pringles were in fact chips in the US, they took a different tact in the UK. In order to avoid a 17.5% value-added tax, VAT, in the UK, Procter & Gamble stated that Pringles should be considered a cake rather than a crisp. Their argument was that since only 42% of the product was made from potato, and the fact that it was fashioned from dough, that it should be considered a cake and not subject to the tax put on chips. After all, that's why the US Food and Drug Administration had previously made them change from being a chip to a crisp. The company initially won in the High Court and were briefly considered a cake in the UK. However, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs appealed the decision, and in 2009 the ruling was reversed and the company had to start paying the VAT. Sadly, they couldn't have their cake and eat it too.
According to Guinness World Records, the de facto authority on world record breaking, this is one of the most common questions they're asked, alongside what record is broken the most often, the heaviest lifted object with glue according to them, and who holds the most Guinness World Record titles, Ashrita Furman with 125 records at last count. In regards to records involving comically giant food, as of 2011, Guinness has a policy in place that all giant food, or records involving large amounts of food, such as most pizzas made in 24 hours, that's 7,539 by a team of Domino's employees in Queensland in 2012, it must be either donated, consumed, or sold for consumption for the record to be recognized as official. This stipulation was put in place for a number of reasons, but mostly was added to prevent such a large amount of food going to waste, something Guinness was being criticized for encouraging. Guinness allows those attempting records to choose between selling or donating giant food in acknowledgement of the fact that such records often require a considerable amount of money, and the option of selling it allows some of that money to be recouped. A second and perhaps less obvious reason for this particular stipulation is that it means the food produced, whatever that may be, has to be edible, making it much harder to break some of these giant food records. For example, when a company called Juicy's Outlaw Grill attempted to create a record-breaking 770-pound burger in 2011, their initial attempt failed when they were unable to cook the 600-pound beef patty they'd made all the way through, meaning the entire burger could not be eaten, and therefore they were unable to fulfill all of Guinness's stipulations to a satisfactory degree, even though they technically did make a 770-pound burger. The company did eventually succeed at breaking the world record and now holds the record for selling the largest commercially available hamburger in the world. The price, a mere $5,000 for over 1 million calories of burgery goodness, give or take, depending on the fat content. And if you're curious, a typical beef cow yields about 450 pounds or 200 kilograms of usable meat, so this world record was essentially about 1 1/3 cow's worth of meat, or about 6,000 McDonald's hamburgers. A further stipulation of creating giant food for a world record attempt is that it must generally resemble the original foodstuff it is based on. For example, a stipulation of creating a giant popsicle is that the final product must be able to stand upright like a regular popsicle without falling apart. This is a rule the company Snapple were unable to abide by when they attempted to create a record-breaking 35,000-pound stick of frozen goo in 2005 and inexplicably tried to erect it in the middle of New York in June. Despite careful preparation beforehand and keeping the giant popsicle frozen during transport to its final destination, the kiwi strawberry popsicle melted before it could be propped up, resulting in thousands of liters of pink sugary liquid shutting off several lanes of traffic, while a bemused fire crew used hoses to wash it down the sewers. Presumably, the rats and other such creatures appreciated Snapple's efforts, even if they didn't get the world record. Perhaps next time they should probably think about doing it in December? Of course, because Guinness isn't always invited along to giant food cook-offs, there's nothing to really stop companies or individuals that create giant food from throwing it away after the attempt is complete. It's just that if they do, the most recognizable record authority in the world won't recognize their attempt. This means the group in question won't get near the publicity, which is generally the point of these sorts of things. On top of that, if they aren't making the food item edible, they just completely wasted their money on the raw ingredients for no good reason. Needless to say, officials from Guinness are often invited to such events, and even when not, the food item is generally meant to be eaten after. And now for a random bonus fact. Ostriches don't hide their heads in the sand. In fact, they can run as fast as 45 miles per hour and sustain long-distance running of about 30 miles per hour. They are also very maneuverable, using their wings to help rapidly change direction. Any predators they can't outrun, they can often kill with their powerful kicks and huge claw-like hoof on each foot. Why they have a reputation for hiding their heads in the sand is that they have incredible hearing and vision and usually spot predators before the predators spot them. When this happens, they often lay as flat as possible against the ground to attempt to just look like a mound of dirt in the distance.